The great departure in the spring of 1848, a strange kind of silence hung over the eastern towns. It wasn't the quiet of peace but of decision, the pause before an entire generation lifted their lives and carried them west, across Missouri, in small wooden towns like Independence and St. Joseph, streets filled with wagons, oxen, and noise. Blacksmiths worked from dawn till dark. Wheelwrights hammered metal rims onto freshly carved spokes. You could smell the mixture of hot iron and pine sap in the air. Every store sold rope, canvas, flour, and salt pork. Every man believed he was ready. No one truly was. The news traveled faster than truth. Pamphlets and word of mouth promised easy fortune, fertile soil, endless land, gold beyond the hills. No one mentioned droughts, blizzards, or loneliness. Dreams were lighter to carry than facts, and so, one by one, people sold what they couldn't pack, left behind what they couldn't bear to sell, and set out for a place they had only seen in their imagination. At the edge of town, wives hugged sisters for the last time, children waved until their arms ached, and old men stood at the fences, pretending not to cry. The wagons rolled out under a pale dawn sky, their wheels cutting deep lines in the wet spring soil. Those lines would dry by noon, but the marks they left in memory would not fade for generations. The first day was always loud, the sound of optimism echoing through every crack of the whip, every creak of leather. But by the second day, silence took over. The land stretched farther than anyone had expected, and the sky seemed to swallow sound itself. When the wind blew across the grass, it felt like the ocean breathing on land. The journey began in spring, but everyone knew summer would bring the real test. The prairie had no shade, no landmarks, only distance. Families learned to move by the rhythm of endurance, wake before light, pack by instinct, and begin walking before the sun found them. There was no schedule, only survival. Meals were quick, coffee boiled black and bitter over small fires, bread was baked on flat stones, beans stirred in iron pots called Dutch ovens. Children gathered buffalo chips for fuel, their laughter echoing oddly across the open plain. Everything was a task, and every task was part of staying alive. At noon, the heat pressed down like a physical weight, hats and scarves soaked with sweat, dust stuck to every inch of skin. Some wagons carried caged chickens, others tied milk cows behind. The animals stumbled, and when one collapsed, it meant more than hunger, it meant something irreplaceable had been lost. By the third week, the prairie began to change them. People stopped measuring distance in miles and began measuring it in how many stories they told before the next river. A day might pass in silence, only the squeak of wheels and the grunt of animals filling the air. But at night, when fires flickered and stars appeared like frost across the heavens, voices returned. Men mended harnesses, women patched clothes by firelight, and children chased fireflies until the night felt kind again. Around those fires, they spoke of what they'd left: factories, debts, narrow streets, and a life that had begun to feel smaller than their dreams. No one said it out loud, but everyone was running from something, some from hunger, some from the law, some simply from the weight of being ordinary. The West promised transformation, that if you could survive it, you could become someone new. They began to give names to places no map had marked: Sleepy Creek, Lost Wagon Hill, Widow's Crossing. Those names stayed long after the people moved on, as if the land itself had agreed to remember. Storms came without warning. The first one hit in June, a black wall of wind and lightning rolling across the horizon. Tents vanished, rain turned the trail into a river of mud, wagons sank to their axles, and the thunder drowned out every prayer. When it passed, they found one wagon overturned, its contents scattered like bones. No one spoke for an hour. There was nothing to say, but the prairie always gave something back. The morning after, the air was so clear it hurt to breathe. Rain had washed everything: the dust, the fear, even the smell of smoke. Children splashed in puddles, women laughed for the first time in days. It was in those fragile moments that people remembered why they had come, to begin again, not just in a new place, but as new people. Animals suffered too. Oxen's hooves split from miles of rock and heat. Horses grew thin, their ribs showing through the leather of effort. Men learned to speak gently to them, for cruelty wasted strength faster than mercy. sometimes they stopped for days just to rest the animals, not out of kindness, but because the wagons couldn't move without them. The rhythm of progress was set not by human will, but by the endurance of beasts. When a horse died, they buried it with the same care as a friend. No one mocked the tears of a man who'd lost his best animal. They all knew what it meant. Without the animal, the journey stopped. Without the journey, the dream ended. Along the trail, small miracles appeared. A spring found by accident. A patch of shade from a lone cottonwood tree. A prairie flower blooming in a crack of stone. Such small mercies became holy. Men removed their hats at the sight of running water, and women whispered thanks to the sky when the fire caught on the first spark. Faith shifted from churches to weather. The sun and rain became their only priests. Every few days they met other caravans heading west, faces burnt, hands cracked, eyes bright. With the same stubborn hope, they traded stories like currency: which rivers were low, which tribes were near, which families had turned back. Some wagons did turn back, but most pressed on, ashamed to return to what they'd fled. Every mile was a promise they refused to break. By late summer, they reached the high plains. The air grew thin, the nights colder, stars felt closer now, as if the heavens had lowered themselves to watch. Coyotes howled, but their cries no longer frightened anyone. Danger had become familiar, almost comforting. One night, an old preacher named Harlan stood by the fire and said, "Maybe God built this land too big on purpose, so we'd have to depend on each other to cross it." No one argued, they just nodded, and in that silence was the closest thing to faith most of them had left. When they finally reached the first wide river, they stopped, not to rest, but to realize what they had done. Behind them lay months of dust and loss. Ahead, a horizon still too wide to measure. They were no longer who they had been. The road had changed them. It had burned away everything unnecessary, leaving only what could endure. They didn't celebrate, they just stood there, watching the water move. Understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the journey itself was the point. And as the sun sank, painting the sky with the colors of ash and fire, someone whispered the only prayer that mattered anymore: "Let us keep moving." The river between worlds. By midsummer, the prairie had become a memory of dust and distance. The travelers had long stopped counting days. Now, time was measured by rivers, each one a border between what they had endured and what still waited. The first of the great crossings came with the Platte, a wide, deceptive stream that looked shallow until it claimed a wagon hole. Its water was thick with clay and memory, moving slow but with the weight of centuries behind it. They called it the river that flows upside down, because it carried more earth than water. At dawn, they lined their wagons along its banks, men stripped to the waist to test the depth, women gathered children and prayed, ropes were tied, oxen driven forward. The sound of shouting mixed with splashing, and for a moment it felt as though the land itself was holding its breath. Halfway across, the current grew stronger, barrels broke free, a wheel cracked, and one wagon tilted, filling fast. 2 men dove to save it, but the weight of flour and iron pulled it down. When it vanished beneath the brown water, a silence fell so heavy it seemed to settle on the sky itself. They buried nothing that day. The river had taken what it wanted. That night the camp was quiet, fires burned low, no one sang. Someone read a psalm, but the words drifted away before they reached the air. Death had become part of the company. Walking just behind the last wagon, never seen, always near. In the dark, a boy whispered to his mother, "Does the river remember us?" She didn't answer, but she held him closer. Some questions were meant only for silence. Morning came cold, fog rose off the water like smoke from the earth. Men mended ropes, checked the oxen, and counted the supplies that hadn't been lost. Every accident redrew the rules of survival. They learned what to tie tighter, what to let go. They learned that no amount of preparation could outthink chance. The trail pressed on. Wheels turned through mud so thick it clung like guilt. Sometimes a single wagon took a full day to move 1 mile. Oxen strained, groaned, and sometimes fell to their knees, steam rising from their backs like ghosts leaving the body. When that happened, everyone stopped, not just to rest the animal, but because the sight reminded them of themselves. The West did not take life quickly. It wore it down, one step at a time. By August, The heat had changed from discomfort to punishment, the sun no longer rose. It arrived like judgment, air shimmered, and each breath tasted of dust and salt. Water became a form of prayer. They rationed it by the cup, measured it, and hoped that a man could go 3 days without it, but few wanted to test that truth. Camps moved closer together now. No one traveled alone, the weak were carried, the sick guarded. Each group became its own small nation of necessity. They argued, forgave, and argued again, because when everything depends on everyone, every word weighs more. At night, they heard coyotes singing from far-off hills, their howls rising and falling like questions. With no answers, sometimes lightning flashed on the horizon, a storm too distant to matter but close enough to dream about. The smell of rain that never arrived became a kind of torture. Cholera came next, as it always did when the water turned slow and warm. It crept through the camp quietly, a whisper between coughs. No one wanted to speak its name, as if silence could keep it from noticing them, but it noticed everyone. The first to die was a young man from Illinois, barely 20. By morning he was gone. They buried him near the wagon tracks, no headstone, just a handful of wildflowers. By the third death, there were no more prayers, only weary repetition: dig, lower, cover, move on. A preacher once said that grief was proof of love. Out here, grief was proof of time. If you had the luxury to mourn, it meant you were still alive. Some families broke away, turning back toward the safety of the known. Others tightened ranks. The road offered no mercy to the hesitant. It demanded faith, not in God, but in the stubbornness of motion. By late August, they reached a stretch of plains so empty that the wind itself seemed lonely. Grass rolled like waves under the sky, insects buzzed in swarms that sounded like static, dust turned the horizon white, and the world seemed to blur between heaven and earth. Here, time no longer moved straight, days felt circular, light, heat, exhaustion, night, and back again, dreams mixed with waking. And more than one traveler confessed to hearing voices in the wind. Some swore they saw figures walking alongside the wagons, not living, not gone, just part of the journey now. Maybe they were imagining, or maybe the land was reminding them that no one ever crossed it alone. When the rain finally came, it didn't fall, it crashed. Thunder rolled so close that it shook the bones, tents tore, fire died, children screamed, oxen bolted. The earth became a mirror of water, reflecting lightning in every direction. In that chaos, one woman, Sarah Holden, gave birth inside a wagon half buried in mud. They said the baby cried once, then fell quiet, as if already listening to the storm outside. When morning came, the sky was washed clean, and Sarah sat by the fire with the child wrapped in canvas. Someone said it was a bad omen to be born in a storm. She smiled faintly and replied, "Then he'll know how to survive." The days that followed were quieter, as if even nature needed to rest. They moved through valleys still dripping from rain, mud drying in their wagon wheels like hardened scars. Every puddle reflected the sky, and for a brief time, the world looked new again. It was then they found a grove of trees near a small stream, a rare patch of green in a land of gold and gray. They decided to camp for 2 days. No one argued. They built fires not for necessity, but for comfort. Children played without being told to. Hush, men washed their clothes, women their faces. Someone even laughed loud enough to startle the horses that night. The sky turned violet and the stars seemed so close you could reach them with a hand. They shared what little they had, coffee, jerky, songs. A man with a broken fiddle played something soft, and for a few minutes, the trail didn't exist. They weren't travelers or survivors, just people again, but the world always moved on. The break ended, the wagons rolled, and the trail reclaimed its rhythm. Ahead lay mountains. Their jagged shapes looked like teeth against the horizon. Everyone stared at them in silence. They knew what it meant: steeper climbs, colder nights, and choices no one wanted to make. The older ones whispered warnings. Crossing too late meant snow. Crossing too early meant hunger. There was no right time, only less wrong. The West didn't wait for the unready. As they approached the foothills, supplies began to run low. Coffee was gone, sugar just a memory. Salt was more valuable than gold. Flour was mixed with bark, and meat, when it appeared, was a celebration. hunger became part of the language. People spoke of food the way poets spoke of love, with longing, with exaggeration, with the quiet understanding that it might never come again, yet somehow, they still shared that a stranger would arrive at a campfire and someone would always push a plate forward. In this place, generosity wasn't virtue, it was logic. No one survived alone. Autumn crept in unnoticed at first, a cool breeze, longer shadows, the slow goldening of grass. Then came the early frost that glittered on the wagons like fine lace, beautiful until you realized what it meant. Winter was coming and the mountains waited. That night, the elders met by the fire. They spoke of speed and safety, of God and gamble. No one wanted to decide, but the decision was already made by the calendar. They would go on. As the flames died low, a young girl whispered, "Will we ever get there?" Her mother looked at the stars, then back at her daughter, and said, "We already are. Every day we're farther from what we were." When the caravan began moving again, there was no more talk of turning back. They had crossed too many rivers, buried too many names. The horizon was not a promise anymore, it was a duty. The next great river awaited, its water black with melted snow from mountains still unseen. As they stood before it, no one spoke. The only sound was wind through the grass and the quiet creak of wagons shifting on their wheels. Someone finally said, "If we can cross this, we can cross anything." No one disagreed, and when the first wagon rolled forward, the rest followed, not because they believed they would make it, but because there was no longer any other way to live. The wheels entered the water, the oxen leaned in, and the caravan began its slow passage through the current, a line of hope cutting through the face of the impossible. By nightfall, most had made it across. A few wagons were gone, lost to the deep bends where the current ran swiftest. They didn't speak their names, but they built a small cairn of stones on the far bank, a marker for anyone who might follow. The fire that night burned brighter than usual, as if defying the dark itself, and above them, the stars seemed to drift east to west, a reminder that even light was moving in the same direction they were. No one could see it then, but that crossing marked the halfway point of the journey. From this river onward, the land would grow steeper, the nights colder, the faith thinner, but they had learned the secret the West demanded of all who sought it. To survive was to move forward, and to move forward was to believe. That was the price, and also the promise, that one step at a time, they were building a world that did not yet exist. When the wagons finally stopped, it wasn't because the road ended, it was because the people did. The land rose gently toward the mountains, a valley where a narrow river twisted through tall grass, and for the first time in months, the air didn't taste of dust. They called it the Bend, because the river curved there like a promise half kept. No one declared it home out loud. They just stopped moving, looked around, and began to unpack. A single moment of stillness became a decision. What had been a campfire one night became a settlement the next. The first tents were patched with wagon cloth, the first houses built from trees felled along the banks. Men worked with hands cracked by wind, their tools borrowed from the dead or shared between families. Each blow of the axe felt like both creation and surrender. They weren't carving land out of wilderness, they were asking permission to stay. By autumn, a shape began to appear where emptiness had been. A corral here, a lean-to there, smoke rising from chimneys no taller than a man. Dogs barked again, and children learned the sound of laughter that didn't echo off wagon wheels. They built what they could, not what they wanted. A roof was 4 walls and a prayer. A door was a blanket nailed to a frame. Windows came later, after people stopped fearing what might look in. The women turned wagon beds into gardens. They saved seeds wrapped in cloths in spring, pressing them into the new soil with careful fingers. When the first shoots broke through, the whole camp came to see. No one spoke, but every face said the same thing: maybe we can live here. The men built a storehouse, not for food but for hope, a place where extra nails, rope, and grain could be kept for whoever needed them next. They called it the Common, and it became the heart of the town. Before the town even had a name. At night, the sound of hammering stopped and another sound took its place: silence, real silence, the kind that doesn't hide behind wind or wheels. It scared some people. After months of motion, stillness felt like danger. Men woke in the dark and listened for threats that weren't there. Women dreamed of rivers and roads that kept moving even after their eyes closed. It took time to believe they could stop. A preacher set up a tent near the river, using the same canvas that once covered a wagon. He said the first sermon was just one sentence: be grateful that the ground holds you. Then he closed the book and sat down. No one needed more words than that. Winter came early. The valley, so gentle in autumn, turned sharp with frost. The river froze at the edges, and the wind carried the smell of snow long before it fell. People gathered wood by the wagon load, stacked it like treasure. They killed the last of their cattle for meat, and the hides became blankets. Every sound seemed smaller now: the crack of a fire, the cry of a baby, the sigh of someone trying not to cry. The snow arrived. In silence. It fell for 3 days without stopping. When it ended, the town was buried waist deep. The world turned white and quiet, and everyone moved slower, as if even thoughts took effort. In those weeks, survival became a rhythm again. Mornings were for thawing water, afternoons for patching roofs, evenings for mending and prayer. A man who owned a Bible read it aloud until the pages froze to his fingers. Another who owned nothing but a fiddle played until the strings snapped from the cold. Both were acts of faith, different forms of warmth. One night, a woman named Margaret lit a candle in her window. She said it was for anyone lost in the storm. By the second night, 5 more candles appeared across the valley. By the third, almost every house glowed. No one said who started it, but the light became a ritual, a way of telling the dark that they were still there. Weeks passed, food ran low, but no one starved. They shared what they had without question. When a child fell sick, everyone brought what they could: herbs, broth, prayers. When the child recovered, the mother wept not just for her own joy, but for the proof that they were no longer alone. Snow melted slowly, revealing what winter had kept hidden: broken fences, lost tools, graves. There were 5 of them now. No one knew who had carved the small wooden signs, but each bore the same words: gone west. Spring returned as if nothing had happened. The river thawed first, then the grass, then the hearts of the people who'd survived. Men unburied their plows, women shook out the blankets and washed the smoke from their clothes. Children ran barefoot again, chasing each other through puddles the color of new sky. It was as if the world had forgiven them for staying. That spring, they built their first schoolhouse. It was nothing more than 4 walls and a dirt floor, but the children filled it with noise until it felt grand. The teacher was a widow named Clara Pike, who taught letters by drawing them in dust. She told her students, each word you learn is a seed. Someday, they'll grow into stories. The first story those children learned was their own. The town began to take a name, slowly, by accident. Someone called it Bend Creek after the river, another shortened it to the Bend. When a trader passed through and asked where he was, the blacksmith simply pointed to the sky and said, right here. The name stuck. By the second year, travelers came through more often. Some stayed a night, some forever. The sound of hammers grew constant again, but it was different now. It wasn't struggle, it was rhythm, the heartbeat of something being born. A small church rose on the hill, built from leftover wagon wood. A bell hung from a beam salvaged from a river crossing. When it rang for the first time, the sound carried across the valley like a memory remembering itself. The people of the Bend learned new kinds of fear, not of hunger or storms, but of change. Would more settlers come? Would the land forgive being divided by fences and fields? Would peace last once gold rumors reached their quiet valley? They didn't have answers. So they built fences anyway, and then tore some down when the wind demanded space. They argued about where the main road should go, then laughed together when it didn't matter, because the river decided that for them. They learned to live with the land, not on it, and in time, it learned to live with them. The third summer brought something no one expected: music, not from a fiddle or a voice, but from the land itself. When the wind blew through the tall grass, it made a sound like distant singing. Some said it was the spirits of those who never made it, others said it was the earth's way of saying welcome back. People began to sit outside in the evenings, listening to that strange melody. It wasn't beautiful in the usual way. It was uneven, wild, but it carried the same tone as their own hearts: tired, persistent, Alive. A preacher wrote in his journal that year, "We came to claim this land, but it claimed us instead." The line was later carved above the door of the church. By the fourth year, the bend had a rhythm of its own. Babies were born who had never seen the trail, children spoke of the journey as a story told by others, men started calling the first travelers the founders. History was already happening, quietly, without knowing it. There were new hardships, drought, sickness, loneliness. But they met them differently now, not with panic, but with patience. The town had learned the oldest truth of the frontier. Endurance is its own kind of faith. One evening, near harvest time, the people gathered by the river for a celebration. They roasted corn, sang hymns, and watched the sun set behind the hills. Someone said, "Do you remember when this was all empty?" An old woman smiled and replied, "It still is. We just learned how to listen to it." The laughter that followed was soft, the kind that carries both joy and understanding. As darkness fell, 1,000 stars rose, reflected perfectly in the slow, calm river. It looked as if heaven itself had decided to rest there for the night, and for the first time in years everyone felt the same quiet certainty, not that the journey was over, but that home had begun. When the snow came, the first snow came without warning. The air had smelled of rain the night before, but when morning rose, the world was white. It didn't fall softly, it arrived. A silent storm that covered every sound, every track, every familiar thing. The bend disappeared beneath it, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had ended in silence. People stood in their doorways, watching the flakes drift down like slow fire. Some smiled, some shivered, and some simply closed the door again, as if the sight of it was too much to bear. They had known winter would come, but not like this, not so complete, not so endless. By noon, the river was gone beneath a sheet of glass, the fields, the fences, the graves, all hidden under one color. For months, they had built, planted, prepared, and still, they were not ready. Inside the cabins, the world shrank. The sound of the wind replaced the sound of hammers. Fires burned day and night, their light flickering against walls of rough wood and memory. Outside, everything was still, but inside, time slowed to a crawl. Each family became its own small universe, measured by the distance between one heartbeat and the next. Food was counted in handfuls, flour turned to dust in the bottom of barrels, coffee was rationed by spoonfuls, and every pot of stew carried a dozen sacrifices. A bit less for each, so there would be enough for all. Men took turns chopping wood in the snow, faces red from cold and effort. They learned the rhythm of survival. 5 swings, pause, breath. Each log split was a small victory against the cold. Sometimes they spoke to the trees before cutting them, not out of superstition, but respect. Everything alive in that valley had earned it. Nights were the hardest, the dark came early and stayed long, windows froze from the inside, candles burned low, and the only light came from the fire. Children huddled under blankets, listening to the groan of the wind outside. It sounded like the voices of the plains, old, cold, patient. To keep fear away, they told stories. The preacher spoke of Noah, the women spoke of rivers and stars, and the men told stories of home, the ones they swore they'd left behind for good. Each story was a piece of warmth passed around the room. When words ran out, they sat in silence and watched the flames, as if the fire might answer the questions they were too tired to ask. Sickness came quietly, as it always did when the air stopped moving. A cough in one cabin echoed through the whole valley. They called it the winter fever, though no one knew its name. The old and the very young suffered first. They burned with heat while the world froze around them. When someone died, the ground was too hard to dig. They wrapped the bodies in canvas and kept them in a shed until spring. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew which families carried that weight. At night, smoke from those cabins rose darker than the rest, thicker, as if grief had a color of its own. One morning, the bell from the church rang once, not loud, just long. No one needed to ask who it was for. In the valley, even death was a shared sound. Yet, even in loss, life continued. A baby was born during the third snow, delivered by candlelight while wind howled outside. when the child cried, the whole cabin exhaled at once. That it sounded like faith returning to the room. They named her Hope, because they needed the reminder. Days turned to weeks, and the snow piled high against doors and walls. People dug narrow tunnels between houses, paths of survival carved into the silence. One could walk from one end of the bend to the other without ever seeing the sky. Men carried food to neighbors who couldn't walk, leaving small bundles at doors, knocking once and vanishing back into the storm. No one said thank you. There wasn't breath to spare for words, but everyone knew gratitude lived in the gesture. When the firewood began to run low, people started burning what they didn't need: chairs, shelves, even parts of wagons. One man burned the lid of his mother's trunk, the one that had carried her Bible from the east. That he cried as it turned to flame, not from regret, but from memory. Every piece of wood carried a story. And in the firelight, those stories returned for a moment before turning to ash. Sometimes, the wind stopped completely. In that silence, they could hear the snow shifting on the roofs, the faint creak of ice forming on the river. The world had stopped moving, but hearts still beat, slow and steady. The only proof that life remained. By February, something inside the people changed. They stopped fearing the cold. It was no longer an enemy, just another part of existence. They began to understand the land in its quietest form, not as a challenge, but as a companion. When they walked outside, their breath rose like prayer smoke, and they realized that survival had made them holy in a way words never could. The snow glittered under moonlight like crushed glass, and footprints from one day disappeared by the next. Time left no mark here. It was as if the valley had swallowed the world and remade it in white. Children drew on the frost of windows little suns and faces and dreams. Those drawings melted each morning, only to return again the next night. Even in this frozen world, imagination refused to die. One evening, when the firewood was nearly gone, the bell from the church rang again. But this time, not for death. A man had seen the first flock of geese flying north. Their wings caught the last light of day, and the sound of them, the wild, free rhythm, cut through the valley like a promise. The next morning, the air felt different, softer. The snow didn't crunch, it sighed. Water began to drip from the eaves. The river, long silent, cracked and groaned, and a dark line of moving water appeared down its center. People came out of their houses, blinking against the light. They stood there, faces pale from winter, eyes shining with disbelief. Children laughed, touching the wet snow as if it were something new. It was when spring finally broke. It didn't arrive with fanfare, just a slow, steady warmth, returned to color. The first green sprouted near the graves, and no one found that strange. It felt right. Life had always grown best where love had been left behind. The town gathered by the river once more. They brought what was left of their food, their music, their stories. The preacher stood with his hat off and said, "This is the season of remembering why we stayed." Then he closed his eyes and listened, not to his own voice, but to the river, flowing again, softly, endlessly, as if the land itself was sighing in relief. People began to laugh, quietly at first, then louder. The sound carried into the hills, echoing where no walls could hold it. They laughed because they were alive, because they had crossed another season, because the silence had not won. That night, as stars filled the thawing sky, Margaret lit a candle in her window again. Others followed. One by one, the valley bloomed with light, tiny suns burning against the dark. No one spoke, but everyone understood. The candles weren't for safety now, they were for gratitude. From the hill, the bend looked like a constellation, each home a star, each flame a story, each breath a continuation. Somewhere in the dark, a wolf howled, not in hunger, but in answer. It was as if even the wild things had learned their names. And as the night settled, the people of the bend closed their eyes, knowing that winter would come again. But no longer fearing it. They had learned the truth of the frontier, the lesson the land had been whispering all along, that the cold always passes, the dark always lifts, and what survives isn't strength, but belonging. The morning begins before the light itself knows it has arrived. Frost clings to every hinge, every nail, every rope stretched overnight between wagons. The west breathes in silence before the first human voice breaks it. Out here, sleep is shallow, even dreams feel like chores waiting to be done. Men rise first. Not because they want to, but because the animals must be fed before the sun does its work. Boots go on stiff and cold. Coffee is black as the night just passed, and thin enough to see the bottom of the tin cup. A man sips it, grimaces, then begins his rounds, check the horses, mend the fence, count what's left of the grain. The list never ends, it simply circles back on itself. The smell of smoke is constant, a reminder that warmth costs wood, and wood costs hours. Chopping, stacking, drying. Even in towns where a lumber mill hums, the air never loses that raw scent of sap and ash. Fire keeps you alive and slowly consumes the world around you. Women wake next, though most never really sleep. They move like ghosts through narrow rooms, stirring embers, setting kettles to boil. Bread dough left to rise overnight is punched down and baked in iron ovens that take half a day to heat. A woman measures time by how many loaves she can make before the sun climbs too high. Some keep a record on scraps of paper, part recipe, part diary, as if writing might hold the walls together. Children stumble out wrapped in blankets, hair wild, cheeks red from cold. They are sent to fetch water before the bucket cracks from ice. The nearest well might be half a mile away, and the return trip uphill. If they slip, they spill it, and there's no second chance until the next hour. Water is the first lesson of responsibility. Breakfast is plain and slow. Cornmeal mush, sometimes bacon if luck has visited recently, sometimes just yesterday's bread dipped in broth. No one complains, complaint is wasted breath. In some homes, the family prays aloud before eating, but even the faithful sound weary. Lord, one man murmurs, help us through another day. And that's all he asks for. After breakfast, the town begins to stir. A wagon rolls down the main street, its wheels cutting ruts through mud that never fully dries. The blacksmith's forge coughs sparks. The bell of the church clangs once, not for service but to mark the hour, a courtesy from a preacher who doubles as timekeeper. There are no clocks in most homes. People read time from chores, not numbers. Shopkeepers sweep dust from their thresholds, though the wind blows more in an instant. The general store smells of kerosene and dried fruit. Shelves hold everything and nothing: soap, buttons, nails, rope, tobacco, medicine bottles half filled with hope. A farmer comes in to barter a sack of oats for lamp oil. Another offers a rabbit pelt for a spool of thread. Coins jingle rarely. Trust weighs more than money. In the back of the store, a notice board leans crooked against the wall. It carries old posters: missing cattle, wanted men, a traveling dentist who promised to return last spring. On one sheet, faded ink still reads piano for sale. No one in town has seen a piano in 10 years, but no one tears it down either. Dreams, like posters, are allowed to yellow in peace. Out on the edge of town, a man named Harlan repairs wagon wheels. His hands are scarred from splinters, his beard flecked with iron dust. He hums hymns while he works, though he hasn't been to church since his wife died of pneumonia 2 winters ago. Every wheel he fixes buys him another week of food and another night of solitude. People greet him kindly but never stay long. Grief is contagious in small places. Women gather water from the creek, washing clothes on stones smooth as their hands. They talk about the weather, about babies yet to come, about letters that never arrived. Sometimes laughter slips out, light and defiant. A stranger might think them carefree, but laughter here is a kind of rebellion, proof that hardship hasn't swallowed them whole. By noon the sun burns white. Shadows vanish, and work slows. Men remove their hats, wipe their brows with handkerchiefs blackened by soot. Children run barefoot despite the heat, their feet are tougher than most men's hands. A few chase a wooden hoop down the street, a few help the blacksmith pump bellows, mesmerized by sparks. the blacksmith's shop is the heart of any town. Without iron, nothing moves, not wagons, not plows, not doors. Inside it smells of sweat and fire and wet earth. Sparks fly like fireflies in daylight. A hammer strike echoes down the street, steady as a drumbeat, the soundtrack of progress. Every new tool forged is another day the town survives. At the edge of the same street stands the saloon, equal parts refuge and ruin. Its swinging doors never stop moving. Some enter for whiskey, others for company, all for forgetting. Behind the counter, the barkeep cleans the same glass over and over. He knows every story in town but tells none of them. Secrets, like liquor, are best served slowly. Toward evening, when the light turns copper, the air changes. The wind softens, and the smell of dinner, beans, salt pork, corn cakes, drifts from every shack. Children chase each other until mothers call them in. Men return home with shoulders sagging, not from labor alone but from the weight of tomorrow waiting to repeat itself. Illness often announces itself at dusk. A cough that won't quit, a fever that glows behind the eyes. There's no doctor nearby, only a widow who knows herbs and superstition. She brews willow bark tea, packs wounds with honey, burns sage to chase evil spirits. Some call her a healer, others a witch. In truth, she's both, depending on the outcome. Death is rarely sudden here, it's a slow negotiation. A family sits by a bedside, counting breaths. Outside, the night carries on, crickets singing, dogs barking, stars indifferent. When the last breath comes, someone covers the mirror and opens the window, letting the soul out. Then they dig. Graves are shallow, prayers short. By morning, work resumes. The living have no luxury of mourning long. Still, the town keeps growing in small, stubborn ways. A new shed, a painted sign, a baby's first cry. Progress is measured in inches, not miles. Every improvement, a repaired roof, a working lantern, feels like a victory wrestled from the jaws of the land itself. At night, lamps flicker behind thin curtains. Families sit together without words. A father sharpens his knife, a mother patches a sleeve, a child traces patterns in the dirt floor. Outside, coyotes howl in unison, a reminder that wilderness still owns everything beyond the fence line. And yet, inside those walls, humanity persists, fragile, flickering, undefeated. People write letters by candlelight. Ink is precious, paper more so. They write small, careful lines, filling every inch with news and longing. We are alive, one woman writes to her sister back east. The harvest was poor, but the children are strong. It's enough. Sometimes the letters are never sent, the act of writing is the comfort. When the candle burns low, she closes her eyes and listens. The wind moans through the cracks, the house breathes, the floor creaks like an old friend. She imagines the day when life will be easier, though she knows such days do not exist here. Still, she dreams. Dreaming costs nothing, and in the West, that's the only thing that truly belongs to you. By mid-season, the rhythm of life has settled into something that looks like order but feels like endurance. The town moves together, not because anyone commands it, but because everyone knows that slowing down means falling behind. Out here, routine is the closest thing people have to safety. At dawn, the church bell tolls, not for worship but for timekeeping. Its echo drifts through the dust, bouncing off barns and unfinished fences. A man hears it while tightening the harness on a mule. A woman hears it while scrubbing the floorboards of a boarding house. Even the children hear it as a reminder that another long day has begun. The streets fill with sound, hammer strikes, wagon wheels, and the chatter of people trying to barter their way through another week. Commerce in these places is more conversation than transaction. A woman offers a basket of eggs for a length of fabric. The shopkeeper smiles and throws in a handful of nails, because he knows her husband is patching a roof that leaks. Every trade carries a touch of mercy. Money changes hands rarely. Trust and memory are the currencies that matter. The town doctor, a thin man with spectacles too small for his face, makes his rounds on horseback. He carries a leather satchel filled with bottles whose labels have long worn off. Inside are miracles and mistakes, quinine, laudanum, whiskey, and a dozen powders that may heal or kill, depending on the dose. People call him Doc, but they rely on him less for cures than for comfort. Most of his work is listening, nodding, and telling people to rest when rest is impossible. There is no hospital. The sick are treated in their own beds, their rooms smelling of sweat and vinegar. Sometimes neighbors stop by to help, bringing broth or prayers. Sometimes they don't, fearing what they might carry home. If a fever spreads, whole families vanish behind closed doors. The town whispers, waits, and pretends not to count the days. Children, oblivious to fear, play outside anyway. They build forts out of tumbleweed and chase stray dogs through alleys. They invent games with rocks and rope, their laughter cutting through the monotony like birdsong. At sunset, their mothers call them back with voices hoarse from worry. The children come running, dirt on their cheeks, life still unbroken in their eyes. As for the women, they hold the town together in ways no one writes down. They keep ledgers, mend wounds, run shops, and bury the dead. They write letters for those who can't, and read them aloud to those who won't. In church, they sing hymns softly, their voices carrying both sorrow and defiance. A frontier woman learns to pray without expecting answers. She believes not because she hopes, but because disbelief offers nothing in return. The men drink. Some because of pain, others because of memory. The saloon is the town's confessional, the whiskey its sacrament. There's always a piano missing keys, always a card game missing honesty. Sometimes a fight breaks out, sometimes the barkeep stops it before it starts. The same men who trade blows at night will work side by side come morning, too tired to remember why they were angry. Law is a fragile thing here. The sheriff's badge shines, but his power doesn't. He settles disputes with words if he can, with bullets if he must. The jail has only one cell, more often used to sober drunks than to hold criminals. True justice happens in whispers, an extra shovel of dirt over a grave, a warning given under a breath. The line between right and wrong is as thin as the horizon travelers pass through, faces burned by sun and distance. Some are heading west, chasing gold or redemption. Others are running from debts, ghosts, or both. The townspeople treat them politely but keep their distance. Strangers bring news, and news brings unease. The last thing anyone here needs is change. When night falls, lamps flicker in the windows like small promises. A teacher, one of the few educated souls in the region, sits by her desk grading papers by candlelight. Her students range from 6 to 16, all crammed into a single room. She teaches them letters, numbers, and the geography of a world most will never see. She earns little, eats less, but she believes that knowledge is the only inheritance worth leaving behind in another home. A woman sews by lamplight, patching trousers that will tear again by week's end. Her husband snores softly in the next room, dreaming of nothing in particular. A baby sleeps in a wooden cradle made from a wagon box. The rhythm of her needle keeps time with the ticking of a broken clock. Both sound steady enough to fool her into thinking the world outside might also hold steady. Meals are simple but sacred. Beans, bread, and maybe a sliver of meat if hunting went well. Food is shared freely, no one in town eats alone if it can be helped. At the boarding house, travelers pay in stories as much as in coins. Around the table, tales grow taller than the men who tell them, outlaws tamed, rivers crossed, fortunes found. Lies become legends, and legends become the glue that keeps weary people from falling apart. Sundays bring a kind of quiet. The stores close, the saloon doors hang still. People gather in the church or around kitchen tables, bowing their heads out of habit more than faith. The preacher speaks of heaven, but everyone is thinking about next week's weather. Heaven can wait, rain cannot. Outside the church, two boys carve their initials into the frame of the door. They don't know why, perhaps to prove they existed, perhaps to leave a mark that outlasts the dust. Around here, legacy is carved into wood, not stone. Cemeteries fill too quickly for permanence. When the sun sets, the whole sky turns copper, and the air smells faintly of iron and sweat. From every home, the same noises rise, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of tired voices, the sighs of people who have worked enough for one lifetime. Crickets sing where pianos fall silent. The night stretches wide, patient, infinite. In that silence, a man might remember the home he left behind, a farm in Illinois, a ship from Ireland, a mother's voice he hasn't heard in 20 years. He might think of returning, though he never will. Distance becomes a kind of gravity. Once you've come this far, you cannot go back. Before sleep, a woman opens her Bible, not to read but to press a flower between its pages. It's brittle now, brown at the edges, but it reminds her of a spring that once promised hope. She closes the book carefully, sets it by her bed, and blows out the lamp. In the darkness, she listens to her husband breathe, to the wind outside, to the soft rhythm of a world still spinning. In spite of everything, tomorrow will look exactly the same. And somehow, that sameness is what keeps everyone alive. By late autumn, the air itself seems tired. The wind no longer rushes, it drags, heavy with dust and disappointment. The prairie grass turns gray, bending low as if bowing to the inevitable cold. And with the fading color of the land comes a change in the people. Faces grow hollow. Voices grow quiet. Hope becomes a story told by those who haven't lived here long enough to know better. Work doesn't stop, even as the ground hardens and daylight fades faster each evening. Farmers still walk the fields, scanning the sky for signs of mercy. Sometimes rain teases the horizon, a dark promise that never arrives. Wells dry first, then tempers. A man who has lost a crop will still drag himself to town, hat in hand, asking for seed on credit he knows he'll never repay. The shopkeeper gives it anyway. Not out of kindness, but because cruelty takes too much energy. Hunger has its own etiquette. People learn not to ask what's in the stew, or where the meat came from. A few grow thin, a few vanish altogether. In times like these, compassion becomes a luxury, suspicion a necessity. A missing chicken, a stolen sack of flour, a child's cry in the night, all of it can start a feud that lasts generations. When someone dies, the burial is quick. No sermons, no tears, only silence and the scrape of a shovel. There are no coffins, just linen, earth, and the wind. A man might say a few words if he feels obliged, but mostly, the dead are entrusted to the land without argument. The living can't afford to linger. Grief delays progress, and progress is the only religion that still functions. Crime changes with the seasons. In summer, men steal horses, in winter, they steal wood. Desperation makes everyone equal. Even the sheriff looks the other way when he catches a boy carrying logs from someone else's pile. He knows the difference between a thief and a survivor. Out here, the law bends so it doesn't break. A traveling preacher sometimes rides through the valley, his wagon painted with Bible verses in flaking gold letters. He holds service in barns or open fields, shouting about redemption to people who barely believe in the next morning. His words echo over the prairie like smoke, visible for a moment, then gone. A few souls find comfort in his fire, most just watch from a distance, hats in hand, too tired to pretend they still need saving. Not all preachers are kind. Some come for coins, others for control. A few build followings that border on cults, demanding confessions, loyalty, or worse. Towns tolerate them for a season, then send them away. Faith is welcome here, fanaticism is not. The West already has enough devils without new ones wearing crosses. The women notice the decline before the men do. They see it in the way bread dough doesn't rise, in how children play less and sleep more. They whisper about illness, about curses, about what happens when hope starves. Some burn herbs in doorways. Others hang iron keys above beds to ward off bad spirits. Science hasn't reached this far yet, so superstition does the job in its place. Winter arrives like a slow tightening of the world. First the rivers freeze, then the windows. Smoke hangs low, refusing to rise. Inside every cabin, the same smell: burnt wood, damp wool, unwashed skin. Families huddle together not out of affection, but to conserve heat. The nights stretch endlessly. Sleep comes in short bursts between the crackling of the fire. Dreams are no longer about the future but about food, those who can't afford coal-burn furniture. Chairs disappear, then shelves, then doors. Some even burn their fences, trading safety for warmth. The rich, if such a word applies here, seal their homes with rags and old paper. The poor seal theirs with prayers. The doctor still makes his rounds, his horse now wrapped in a tattered blanket. He treats frostbite, coughs, and despair in equal measure. When medicine runs out, he mixes hot whiskey with honey and hope. It cures nothing but softens everything. Sometimes, that's enough. The school stays open through December. The teacher wears gloves with the fingertips cut away so she can still hold chalk. The children breathe steam into the air, their lessons fogging the room like ghosts. She teaches arithmetic, though she knows most of her students will never need numbers beyond what it takes to count cattle or bullets. Still, she teaches. Knowledge feels like rebellion in a place built on survival alone. Outlaws roam the trails more often in winter. They know hunger drives travelers to desperation, and desperation makes for easy prey. A lone wagon on the road is a beacon. Families huddle close when the dogs bark at night, praying the sounds outside are only coyotes. The sheriff patrols when he can, but his horse is as thin as his resolve. The real protection comes from neighbors who stay awake in shifts, rifles resting across their knees, letters from the east slow to a trickle. Snow buries the roads, the mailman doesn't risk his life for someone else's words. Isolation becomes a second winter, colder than the first. People stop talking about what's coming in the spring. Instead, they talk about who's still alive, and yet, even in this frozen silence, small miracles persist. A woman gives birth in a cabin lit only by a lantern. The baby's cry cuts through the wind like a spark in darkness. Neighbors arrive with blankets and broth. Someone laughs for the first time in weeks. For one night, the town feels less like a place and more like a promise. When the thaw finally comes, it's violent. Ice cracks, roofs leak, and rivers overflow. The land smells of rot and renewal. People drag broken furniture into the sunlight, rebuild fences, and bury what winter took. The cemetery grows by a few more names, but so does the population. Life and death march forward together, unwilling to separate. The first green shoots push through the mud like defiance. Children chase each other again, women hang laundry that actually dries, and men sharpen tools for another year of uncertainty. The preacher returns, dustier but no wiser, proclaiming that the worst has passed. The townsfolk nod politely, they know better. Out here, there's always another storm waiting its turn. Evenings bring a different kind of quiet now. The silence after survival, not before it. People sit on porches, smoking pipes or mending nets, watching the sky bruise itself into dusk. No one talks much. Words are saved for when they matter, and most things don't. A child hums a tune with no name. Somewhere a woman hums the same melody, and for a moment the world feels connected, however briefly. A man writes a letter by the dying light, we are still here. It's all he can think to say. It's all there is to say. And in the grand story of this vast, merciless land, that single sentence is victory enough. Spring doesn't arrive here in color, it arrives in sound, the creak of thawing wood, the drip of melting snow, the slow groan of the earth waking from its long freeze. Birds return first, cautious and thin. Then the people, stepping outside like prisoners uncertain of their release. After months of gray silence, even the mud feels alive, the town begins its cycle again. Fences are rebuilt, roofs patched, seeds planted in soil still cold to the touch. Every act of labor is also an act of faith. They work because they must believe that the land will answer this time. Some whisper small prayers into the dirt before covering it with their palms. No one knows if it helps, but hope is a habit as old as hunger. The blacksmith's forge breathes smoke once more. The hammer's rhythm returns to the air, steady and familiar. Men nod to one another as they pass, measuring worth not in words but in effort. The women hang laundry that flutters like flags of quiet victory. Children splash through puddles, laughing at the mud their mothers curse. Even weariness seems softer under the new sun. Still, hardship never truly leaves, it just changes its shape. The crops may sprout, but a late frost can undo weeks of work. Wells fill again, only to taste of iron or rot. Livestock wander off, vanish, or fall sick. In this place, success is never a guarantee, only a reprieve. People learn not to celebrate too loudly, as if joy itself might draw misfortune. Travel picks up again when the trails dry. Wagon trains crawl through the horizon, loaded with faces both new and familiar. Some settlers return east, broken by the endlessness of it all. Others push farther west, chasing a version of freedom that always seems one ridge away. The town waves them goodbye with a mix of pity and envy. Staying and leaving both take courage. The preacher speaks more softly now. His sermons no longer thunder about heaven or damnation. He talks instead about endurance, about kindness as a form of prayer. The pews remain half empty, but those who come listen differently. Faith out here isn't loud, it's quiet, stubborn, and deeply private. People don't speak of miracles, they live them one breath at a time. In the evenings, music returns. A fiddle wails from the saloon, joined by a harmonica and the thump of boots on wooden floors. Laughter spills into the street like spilled whiskey. For a few hours, no one is poor, or lonely, or haunted by drought. The songs are old, borrowed from homelands half a world away, but they fit the rhythm of this soil now. The West doesn't erase people, it remakes them. Not far from town, a small schoolhouse stands, whitewashed, leaning slightly to the east. Inside, chalk dust floats in beams of afternoon light. The teacher keeps a jar of buttons as rewards for good work. Her students earn them slowly, proudly, trading them later for small favors, a piece of bread, a turn with the book of stories. In a world built on scarcity, kindness becomes its own economy. when the mail rider finally returns after months lost to storms, the town gathers as if expecting a miracle. He carries a leather sack of letters, each one a heartbeat from another life. Some cry when they hear news, others laugh, a few simply stand still, unable to read or unwilling to know. The dead write no letters, and silence carries its own weight. Still, holding paper in one's hands feels like touching civilization again. Some nights, the old men gather outside the saloon, pipes glowing in the dark. They talk about the past, the wars, the trails, the people who vanished without graves. Their stories blend truth and invention, but no one corrects them. Out here, memory is more precious than accuracy. A good story keeps the dead alive, at least until morning. Women listen from porches, rocking slowly, their hair silvered by wind. They've seen everything already: fire, famine, birth, betrayal. Nothing surprises them anymore, not even joy. When they laugh, it's soft, private, like a secret shared with the night. They don't call themselves strong, they just keep going, and that's the truest strength there is. The younger ones, those who grew up here, have never known any other world. They don't dream of cities or ships or green hills beyond the plains. To them, this is all there is: the dust, the sky, the distance. They build futures not on escape but on adaptation. Some open shops, others farms. A few take over the work of parents who never made it to old age. Continuity becomes its own victory. By midsummer, the fields shimmer gold again. The harvest looks good from a distance. Men cut and bind the stalks, sweat running down their backs. The air hums with flies, but no one complains. The buzzing means life. Wagons creak under the weight of grain, and for once, the town smells of plenty. At the end of the day, when the sun sinks low, even the poorest table holds a full plate. That night, the preacher calls for a gathering. Not a sermon, just a celebration. They string lanterns between trees, play music, and dance until their feet ache. Old rivalries are forgotten, new promises are made. A young couple marries under the open sky, their vows carried away by the wind. No papers, no rings, no witnesses, just belief. Out here, belief is enough. Later, when the fire burns down to embers, people linger. The stars shine harder than lamps ever could. Someone tells a story about the first settlers, about how they crossed rivers with nothing but faith and the will to keep walking. No one knows if it's true. It doesn't matter. The story feels real because it needs to be. As the night deepens, the town grows quiet again. Doors close, lamps dim, and the last song fades into the wind. In one small cabin, an old man sits alone by his window, staring at the horizon. He remembers every name, every face that came and went. He knows he will join them soon. But he doesn't fear it. He only hopes that when the morning comes, the town will still wake, still breathe, still exist, because that's what survival means here: not victory, not conquest, but continuation. To wake again, to build again, to love again, even knowing it all may burn or freeze or vanish by next season. The land takes everything, but somehow the people remain, and when dawn finally touches the plains, stretching shadows across the quiet town, the world looks almost gentle. Smoke rises from chimneys, the blacksmith's hammer begins its song, and a child's laughter floats through the air like a fragile promise. The West endures, not as a dream, not as a legend, but as a rhythm that never truly stops. The second summer arrived like a punishment that no one remembered earning. At first, people told themselves the heat would break as it always had, but the days stretched longer, the air thickened, and the light itself began to feel cruel. By the end of June, even the birds were quiet. Every morning began with the same sound, the crack of a dry board beneath a boot, the slow rasp of a pump handle dragging nothing from the ground. The earth had sealed itself shut, each well that had once offered water now sighed out only air. People still lowered buckets, out of habit more than hope, and stood listening for the splash that never came. Cattle wandered in circles, licking stones for moisture, their hides hung loose, ribs sharp as fence posts. Men cursed softly, not at the animals but at the sky. They dug again, deeper this time, until the rope burned their palms. Once, a man struck damp soil and shouted like he'd found gold. But by dusk the pit had filled with nothing but dust. Inside the town, life moved slower but never stopped. The blacksmith's hammer still rang, though softer now that he worked shirtless, soot clinging to his skin, a jug of warm water beside the anvil that he never touched. Iron cooled too fast, fire demanded too much. Still, he forged door hinges, nails, a single horseshoe, because stopping meant accepting defeat, and no one here could afford that luxury. Women carried water in jars wrapped with rags to keep it from boiling in the sun. They baked flatbread on iron griddles laid over dying coals. When flour ran out, they crushed dried corn, or acorns, or even the pulp of cactus fruit that tasted bitter, but it filled the stomach enough to quiet the shaking. Children learned to chew slowly, to make a crust last as long as a conversation. The preacher kept preaching, though his voice cracked like old wood. He spoke of job and patience, of deserts that bloomed after 40 years of suffering. No one laughed, but no one walked away either. It was better to hear something than to face the silence. Night, the silence thickened until it seemed alive. Even the crickets had gone still. Families sat together without words, each listening to the pulse in their own ears, each pretending the sound meant they were still alive. Sometimes the wind would pass through the cracks in the walls and whisper like a voice trying to remember a prayer. The doctor, thin as a broom handle, made his rounds with a bag that rattled like bones. Inside were bottles labeled in a language no one could read anymore: quinine, laudanum, something for fever, something for pain. That he mixed powders by candlelight, measuring with a hand that trembled from exhaustion. Rest, he told them. Drink water. Both were impossible orders. That he kept a ledger of deaths, neat rows of names and dates that blurred with sweat. When the ink ran out, he scratched lines with charcoal. When that ran out, he memorized. Some nights he dreamed of forgetting, but memory was the only medicine he still had. Then came the dust storms. They rose from the horizon like brown walls, rolling faster than a galloping horse. By the time you saw one, it was already too late. People stuffed rags under doors, covered children with blankets, and prayed their homes would hold. The wind screamed through every crack, 1,000 knives made of sand, windows shattered. Chickens suffocated. When the storm finally passed, everything was the same color: earth, sky, faces, grief. The morning after, the preacher stepped outside and found his church half buried. He didn't dig it out. Instead, he climbed onto the roof and began to sing, his hoarse voice breaking between verses. No one joined him, but everyone heard. Sometimes faith is less a song than a noise made to prove you're still there. In the saloon, men gathered not to drink but to remember what thirst used to feel like. Whiskey was gone. The barkeep poured anything wet. Some swore it was creek water, others that it was tears. No one cared. They raised their cups like soldiers saluting a flag, and for a brief moment the world felt ordinary again. A woman named Clara refused to leave her land. Her husband was buried beneath a cottonwood behind their cabin. Every dawn she carried a pitcher of water to the tree, poured it slowly around the roots, and whispered, "Drink before it's gone." The ground soaked it up in seconds. When neighbors begged her to go north, she said simply, "He wouldn't find me if I left." Grief, in places like this, becomes geography. Children still played, though the games had changed. They raced their own shadows, counted tumbleweeds, built forts from bones of cattle bleached white by the sun. Their laughter was thin and high, like the whine of the wind through wire fences. Mothers watched from doorways, half smiling, half counting how many still had strength to run. Midsummer, the wells were dead, the fields were ghosts. People began walking east at night, following rumors of rain. Like pilgrims, You could tell who had left by the absence of smoke in the morning. Each departure left the town lighter, quieter, as if the place itself were exhaling its people one by one. Then, after 81 days without rain, the sky cracked open, lightning flashed white across the plains. A single drop hit the ground, then another, then 1,000. The first sound of thunder felt like forgiveness. People ran outside laughing, tilting their faces upward, hands open to catch what they'd been begging for. But the joy lasted only minutes. The rain turned violent, sheets of water hammered roofs until they collapsed. The ground, too hard to drink, sent the flood racing downhill. The creek became a river, and the river became a wall. By dawn, half the town was gone. Barrels, fences, entire wagons floated away. The church bell clanged once, twice, then vanished under the current. When the storm passed, the air smelled of mud and loss. The survivors gathered on the hill, faces streaked with soot and rain. No. One cried, the water had already done that for them. They buried the dead in silence, marking graves with stones because there was no wood left for crosses. Then they began again. They always began again, hands blistered, backs bent, hearts stubborn. The blacksmith built new nails from the wreckage of old ones. The women washed what clothing the river had spared. Children collected driftwood as if rebuilding the town were a game. Weeks later, when the land finally dried, a stranger rode in from the east. He wore a clean coat, his boots polished, his face still carrying the softness of someone who believed in luck. He spoke of the railroad being built beyond the ridge, of wages, of progress, of towns where water came from pipes and not from prayer. The word progress tasted foreign but beautiful. Some listened, some didn't. Those who had buried too many stayed. Those who still had dreams left followed him into the horizon. That night the remaining few lit a fire in the center of town. They cooked what they had: beans, bread, silence. Someone played a fiddle missing a string. Children danced barefoot in the dust. And for the first time in months, laughter sounded like something that could last. When winter came, it came soft. Frost glazed the windows but didn't bite too deep. Smoke rose from every chimney, a dozen thin signals of life insisting on being seen. Inside, families sat close, sharing stories of what they'd lost and found. No one mentioned fear. It had become too familiar to name. Outside, the cottonwood stood bare but unbroken. At its roots, a patch of earth stayed damp, as if remembering Clara's water. The West doesn't forgive, but sometimes it forgets, and in that forgetting there's a kind of mercy. The survivors learned to move slower, to speak less, to trust the quiet between disasters. When morning light crept through the cracks, they rose again, not because they believed things would get better, but because they refused to let them get worse. And so the cycle began anew: dust, drought, flood, frost. And the stubborn heartbeat of those who remained. It was never heroism. It was simply the habit of staying alive. When the flood finally withdrew, it left behind not relief but silence. The land glistened like a wound under weak sunlight, raw, red, waiting to scar. Mud covered everything: boots, wagons, fences, even the few graves that still held their names. People stepped carefully, afraid the ground might open again and take what little was left. For a week they did nothing but look. At the broken houses, the tangled branches, the water lines halfway up the church door. It felt wrong to move too soon, as if motion might offend whatever mercy had spared them. But hunger has no patience, and so one morning, a boy picked up a shovel. By sundown, the whole town was working. They dug trenches to drain the lowlands, hauled timber from the forest and stacked bricks salvaged from the saloon's fallen wall. No one gave orders. Everyone simply acted. Even the preacher traded his Bible for a hammer. He said, God built the world with his hands first, then with his words. We can do the same. That line was repeated for months whenever arms ached or tempers flared. The blacksmith rebuilt his forge using the frame of a wagon. He had lost nearly everything except his anvil and his pride. By the third day, smoke rose again above his shop, and the ring of his hammer drifted across the valley like a heartbeat. It was said that as long as that sound continued, the town could not die. Women returned to their routines, but with harder eyes. They washed clothes in the new river that the flood had carved, their hands raw and red, voices humming the same three-note tune to keep rhythm. At night they met to mend torn clothes, trade candles, and speak softly of the ones gone. Someone began keeping a list, names of the lost, scratched into a board with a nail. By the time it filled, they flipped it over and kept writing. Children scavenged through the ruins, finding spoons, bits of glass, bent spoons turned into treasures. They built tiny houses out of brick fragments imitating their parents' work. With fierce seriousness, sometimes they pretended their toys were people who had survived too. The doctor reopened his clinic in the half-collapsed barber shop. He had little medicine, so he prescribed tasks. Help your neighbor, he said. Work until you're tired enough to sleep. For the sick, he offered water with sugar and a promise: the body remembers. He believed it, even when no one else did. By the time spring bloomed, a strange beauty had returned. Green shoots pushed through the mud as if daring the sky to try again. Frogs sang in puddles that once drowned homes. The people watched and whispered thanks without words. Then came the newcomers. They arrived with wagons covered in canvas, faces burned by travel, eyes full of questions. They had heard about the flood and expected emptiness, but instead they found movement, a town stubbornly alive. Some of the old settlers resented them, calling them fresh souls for the dirt. Yet others welcomed them with open hands. There were fields to plant, roofs to repair, and graves to tend, plenty of work for all. Among them was a carpenter named Ezra Pike. He was quiet, deliberate, a man who measured twice and spoke once. He carried a small Bible tucked into his tool belt, and when he prayed, he did it under his breath, as though faith were something fragile. He began by fixing doors that no longer closed and tables that no longer stood straight. When someone asked his price, he said, "Pay me when the harvest smiles." Ezra built the new schoolhouse, a small square of pine boards on the hill above town. He and a dozen volunteers worked from dawn to dusk, raising walls by lamplight when days grew short. When the last nail was driven, the preacher blessed the doorway and said, "Let this be the one building where we never whisper about death." Everyone nodded, though no one truly believed it. The school opened with 12 students. Miss Wells, the teacher, was only 23, with ink-stained fingers and a voice that carried calm like a lullaby. She taught letters, numbers, and patience. On the first day, she wrote a single word on the board in white chalk: continue. The children copied it again and again until the floor was dusted white. Years later, when storms came and the roof leaked, they traced that word with their fingertips and remember what it meant. Commerce slowly returned, though no one called it that. The general store reopened with half its shelves bare. Trade replaced coin, flour for candles, rope for grain, labor for kindness. Once a month, a wagon came from the next town with salt, matches, and rumors. Those rumors were worth more than the goods. They carried proof that the world still existed beyond the hills. When the railroad surveyors appeared, the town froze as if seeing ghosts. Men in clean coats, holding brass instruments, measuring, marking. They spoke of progress, of steel and steam, of wages that could build futures. Some hearts lifted, others clenched. Progress, they knew, was a hungry guest. It never left without taking something. Soon, tents filled the ridge, hundreds of workers, their fires flickering against the sky like a second line of stars, the nights filled with foreign songs and hammer strikes echoing in rhythm. Children sneaked up the hill to watch the rails grow, gleaming like a promise no one trusted yet. The saloon became the town's heartbeat again. It wasn't about drinking, there wasn't much liquor left anyway. It was about gathering, hearing voices louder than one's own. Someone always played the fiddle, someone always told the same joke badly, and every night ended with the same quiet toast, to staying. Conflict, however, returned with company. A brawl broke out between a railroad worker and a local farmer over water rights. No one remembered who threw the first punch. The sheriff stepped in too late. As usual, the worker was buried the next morning under a tree that didn't have a name. The preacher said, "Every new beginning asks for blood." And the town, weary but honest, knew he was right. But there were gentler changes too. Women began organizing sewing circles again, not just for mending but for conversation. They shared recipes, traded seeds, even laughed. They planted small gardens behind every cabin, flowers at first, then beans, then hope.by midsummer. Color had returned to the valley. The scent of basil and smoke drifted together on the wind.at dusk. Families sat on porches, watching the sun bleed out behind the hills. Children dozed with heads on their mothers' laps. Fathers smoked pipes carved from bone. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was earned. They had outlived water and fire. They deserved the silence. That August, a letter arrived addressed only to the town. No one knew who sent it or where it came from. It said, in shaky handwriting, "We heard the rail is near. Hold on. We're coming." Some thought it was from relatives long lost. Others said it must be from dreamers. The preacher nailed it to the church door beside the old one that read, "We are still here." Together they looked like a conversation between the living and the future. When the first train whistle finally echoed through the valley, the townspeople stood in silence. Smoke rose on the horizon, followed by the gleam of steel and motion. Children waved, old men removed their hats. The preacher whispered, "It's the sound of the world finding us again." But a few turned away, unsure whether being found was a blessing or the beginning of another kind of loss. That night, the town didn't sleep. People talked under lamplight, wondering what would come next. A station, a telegraph, maybe even strangers who would call this place home. The possibilities felt enormous, frightening, beautiful, and yet, when dawn came, they still did what they had always done. They fetched water, fed animals, swept porches. Progress could come on rails or wings, but the rhythm of survival would always sound the same: hammer, breath, heartbeat, silence. The preacher walked through town at sunrise, passing the new schoolhouse, the rebuilt saloon, the fields already shimmering with dew. He paused by the church door, looked at the two letters pinned there, and smiled. "That we are still here," he whispered, then he added softly, "and we're not done yet." The railroad didn't just bring trains, it brought the future, and the future was loud. The first engine screamed across the valley like a living thing, its black smoke curling upward, staining the new sky. Children ran after it, waving their arms and shouting. The old men watched from their porches, hands on their knees, faces blank with something they couldn't name. It was awe, yes, but also mourning. For years, they had lived in rhythm with the wind and the seasons. Now, a machine had replaced both. The steady pulse of iron wheels on steel rails became the town's new heartbeat. Every dawn began with a whistle, every evening ended with its echo fading into the hills, reminder that the world no longer turned around them, it passed through them. With the train came strangers, some carried briefcases, others rifles. They arrived with words like investment, expansion, and survey. The townsfolk didn't understand half of it, but they knew enough to realize that everything was changing, and not necessarily for them. The first to leave were the farmers whose fields were cut in two by the rails. The company men said they'd be paid in due time. That time never came. They packed what they could onto wagons and vanished east, faces turned away like men ashamed of surviving. The saloon, once a place of comfort, became a border between two worlds. At one table, railroad engineers drew plans in chalk on the bar's surface. At another, cowhands played cards in silence, pretending not to hear talk of the future being bought and sold around them. The barkeep poured for both sides, his hands steady, his eyes tired. He'd seen enough to know that every boom starts with the sound of someone being left behind. Prices rose. So did tempers, would cost more. Water was rationed, and gossip spread faster than disease. There were rumors that the company owned the sheriff now. No one said it outright, but the way his badge gleamed too bright in the lamplight told enough. A man named Harlan, once the quiet blacksmith, was arrested after refusing to sell his land to the company. They called it obstruction of progress. He called it theft. By morning, he was gone, no trial, no farewell. The forge stood cold for weeks after. The preacher tried to keep the peace. He held meetings under the church's new roof, his voice echoing off fresh pine boards. Progress isn't evil, he said, but it has a price. The trick is remembering what you're paying with. The congregation nodded, Though few understood that it's hard to think about cost when you're just trying to eat, the newcomers called the old settlers relics. They said the town needed order, that laws written by memory had to be replaced by contracts on paper. The settlers listened, quiet but burning inside. For years, they had survived without signatures or seals, only trust and hard work. Now men in suits demanded deeds for land their fathers had bled on. Ezra Pike, the carpenter, was one of the few who managed to stand between both sides. That he built furniture for the company offices and repaired doors for his neighbors. That he said, "Wood doesn't care who it serves, as long as you treat it right." But even he could feel the tension growing, the way people's eyes lingered too long on strangers, the way the laughter in the saloon ended quicker each night. The doctor's practice, once filled with farmers and miners, now treated accidents from the rail yard, burns, crushed hands, severed fingers. The price of progress was written in blood on his floors. That he no longer kept his ledger. There wasn't enough ink for all the names. That he began to drink at dusk, quietly, and some nights, when he staggered past the church, the preacher pretended not to see. Children adapted faster than anyone. They stopped playing in the dust roads and started playing on the tracks. That they press coins onto the rails to see them flattened into smooth, shiny discs. Good luck charms, they called them. Their parents scolded them, but deep down, they envied how easily the young accepted the new world. A new general store opened near the station. That it was larger, brighter, and carried goods the old one never could. Canned fruit, sugar, even fabric dyed blue. The townsfolk loved it, though some walked in with guilt, glancing at the older shop now empty down the street. The man who ran it, old Turner, sat on the porch and watched the people pass him by. He never closed his store officially, he just stopped opening it. The first telegraph line went up that autumn. A single wire stretched across poles like a spider's thread through the valley. When the operator tapped out the first message, no one in town understood what was said, but they felt it. The air itself seemed to hum with the sound of distance collapsing. For the first time, the West felt smaller. Not everyone celebrated. A few nights later, someone cut the wire. No one confessed, but the preacher found a scrap of paper tacked to the church door that read, "We don't need their voices in our sky." He left it there for a week before taking it down. Winter came early that year. Snow fell over the tracks, muting the sound of progress for a while. The town exhaled. The engines still ran, but their whistles sounded lonelier now, echoing through white emptiness instead of dust. Inside the homes, life went on. Women mended coats with thread pulled from old curtains. Men gathered near stoves, talking softly about the world beyond the ridge. A world they now felt both part of and exiled from. Children read by lantern light, their schoolbooks filled with maps that no longer matched the land outside. The preacher wrote letters by candlelight, addressed to no one. He wrote about the sound of hammers, about the smell of coal smoke, about the way the stars still managed to shine through it all. Then he folded the pages and placed them under the church floorboards. If God still reads, he said to himself, he'll find them here. One night, a fire broke out in the new station house. Some said it was an accident, others whispered it was revenge. By dawn, only ashes remained. The company men rebuilt it within a week, bigger, stronger, closer to the tracks. No one was arrested. No one was innocent either. After that, the company posted guards. Strangers with rifles patrolled the streets at night. The sound of boots replaced the sound of crickets. The town no longer belonged to its people, it belonged to whoever could afford to buy it. Piece by piece, and yet, in the smallest corners, the old ways refused to die. A woman still left bread on her neighbor's porch. A boy still brought water to the blacksmith's cold forge. The preacher still rang the church bell every Sunday, even when no one came. Each act was a seed buried in hard soil, a quiet rebellion against forgetting. By spring, wildflowers began to grow along the tracks, bright yellow and white, softening the iron with color. Travelers passing through never noticed them, but the townsfolk did. They said it was the land forgiving them, or maybe just reminding them that beauty still belonged to those who stayed. When the first train of the new season arrived, a crowd gathered as always. Among them stood Miss Wells, the teacher, her students clutching slates and notebooks. She pointed at the locomotive and said, "Remember this sound, someday it will be history." The children nodded, but none of them believed that something so big could ever fade. That night, the preacher sat alone by the river, watching moonlight shimmer on the steel rails. That he thought about all that had changed, and all that hadn't. The land still demanded sweat, the wind still whispered the same warnings, and the people, for all their talk of progress, still feared the dark in the same old way. That he closed his eyes and prayed, not for salvation, but for balance, for a world where the past and the future could stand on the same ground without tearing each other apart. The river carried his words away, soft as the sound of a train disappearing into distance. By the time the second spring after the railroad came, the town had learned a new silence. It wasn't the silence of shock or mourning anymore. It was the quiet rhythm of endurance, the kind that settles into the bones like an old ache. The tracks still shimmered in the distance, cutting across the hills like a scar that had learned to heal. Without forgetting, when trains passed, people no longer ran to watch, they simply paused mid-sentence, listening to the iron thunder roll over the valley, and then went back to their chores. The sound was no longer foreign, it was just another kind of weather. Letters arrived regularly now, thin envelopes, some from sons who'd gone east to find work, some from daughters who'd married rail workers and sent photographs that didn't quite look real. In those pictures, the sky seemed smaller, the people cleaner, their faces frozen mid-smile. The townsfolk would pass them around at the saloon, studying them as if they were maps to a place that might not exist. The postmaster, a wiry man named Boone, hung a bell above his door to signal when mail came. Every time it rang, hearts lifted. Even if the letters weren't for them, hope didn't need a name, just the sound of paper landing on wood. Ezra Pike, the carpenter, had aged 2 decades in 2 years. He built benches by the tracks not for business, but for the comfort of watching movement. He no longer needed to join. Every evening he'd light his pipe, sit in his coat that smelled of cedar and smoke, and watch the trains thunder past. He'd lift his hat slightly to each one, a gesture halfway between greeting and farewell. Sometimes children joined him, counting the boxcars aloud, shouting when they reached 100 and starting again. Once, a small boy asked, "Mr. Pike, where do they all go?" Ezra smiled without turning. "Everywhere that isn't here," he said. "Some folks chase distance like it's salvation, but distance has its own hunger, it eats the ones who follow too long." The preacher's sermons had grown quieter, his words stripped down to bone. He spoke of patience, of staying, of grace found in ordinary work. "Faith," he said, "isn't waiting for God to fix the world. It's waking up anyway." Some weeks only 3 people came to hear him. Still he rang the bell. Sound meant life, and he refused to let it stop. The doctor's hands shook too much to stitch anymore. He trained a younger man from the rail camp, a thin fellow named Harrow, who spoke with city polish. At first, the townsfolk didn't trust him. His boots were too clean, his words too careful, but when a fever swept through the valley that spring, it was Harrow who stayed awake 3 nights straight, boiling rags and whispering encouragement to every patient. After that, they called him Doc, without hesitation. The old doctor watched from his porch, wrapped in a blanket, a glass of whiskey balanced on his knee. When Harrow passed by after a long day, the old man would raise the glass and nod as if handing the world over in silence. Miss Wells' schoolhouse thrived. Children filled it until the benches creaked. Some came from new settlements farther along the rail line. Their accents were different, their clothes newer, but within a week they were indistinguishable. Every child dirt-streaked, bright-eyed, hungry to learn. Miss Wells no longer taught from books alone, she taught from the land, how to read the color of clouds, how to count time by shadows, how to listen for the rhythm of work and rest. Behind the school, she started a small garden. The children watered it each morning before class. When the first shoots appeared, they cheered as if they'd invented green itself. She told them, "A seed is the smallest promise you can keep." The saloon had changed too. It wasn't a place of noise anymore, it was memory made wooden and still. The barkeep, older now, kept one shelf for liquor and one for letters never claimed. Some nights he'd read them aloud to whoever remained. One was from a man apologizing to his wife for leaving, another from a woman describing rain in the city like it was a miracle. They drank to each, to laughter, to regret, To everything human, across town, old Turner's abandoned store had become a gathering hall. The preacher held harvest feasts there, women organized sewing circles, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, Miss Wells would read from books by lantern light. Her voice filled the room softly, like a blanket spread over everyone still breathing. By autumn, the valley had taken on a new rhythm. Children fetched water, men repaired roofs, and women traded recipes that made hunger bearable. The sky remained vast and unpredictable, but the people beneath it had learned the art of bending without breaking point. One day, a photographer arrived on the train, a thin man in a bowler hat with a wooden camera and the nervousness of someone used to silence that he asked to take a picture of the town. People gathered awkwardly near the well, unsure how to stand. Ezra Pike refused to join. That he said, "Some things shouldn't be captured. You take a picture of survival, and it starts to look easy." The photographer didn't understand, but he took the photo anyway. When he left, the townsfolk stared at their frozen faces in disbelief. It looked like ghosts pretending to be alive. That winter came early. Snow covered the rails until trains passed like phantoms through fog. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin silver ribbons. Inside each home, families told stories to keep the dark at bay. They spoke of the old drought, the great flood, the first train, and always, of those who had stayed. Miss Wells began writing those stories down. At first she said it was for her students, but she soon realized it was for herself, a way to keep the world from slipping into forgetting. She filled pages with names, sounds, smells, the taste of dust after rain, the creak of the saloon floorboards, the way the preacher's bell cracked on cold mornings. She titled it The Ones Who Stayed. One night, as snow fell soundlessly outside, the preacher knocked on Ezra's door. They sat together by the stove, their silence companionable, like two men who had outlived too many words. "Do you ever miss it?" the preacher asked finally. Ezra smiled, eyes lost in the firelight. "Every day," he said. "But missing means it mattered." They spoke until the wood burned low. Before leaving, the preacher placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. "You built half this town," he said. Ezra shook his head. "No," he said softly. "The town built me. I just didn't fall apart." When the preacher returned at dawn to check on him, the stove was cold, the chair empty, and a small note lay on the bench by the door. "Don't grieve. Keep building." They found his hat later that morning, frozen into the snow beside the tracks. No footprints led away. Miss Wells carved his name into the schoolhouse step, so that every child would step over it on their way to learn. Spring returned gently that year, as if the world itself were tired of cruelty. Wildflowers bloomed along the tracks again, white, yellow, pink. Each year they spread a little farther, until the whole valley looked painted by forgiveness. The preacher added a new sign at the edge of town. Ezra had made the old one, "We endure." Beneath it, the preacher carved a single line, "We remember WHY." Then, few trains stopped anymore. The world had moved on, seeking faster routes, brighter lights, but the town stayed, rooted like the cottonwood tree behind the church, its branches bare some seasons, but always alive underneath. Visitors passing through asked, "Who still lives here?" And whoever they asked, a farmer, a teacher, a widow, a child, would answer the same, "Just the stubborn ones." Then they'd smile, because in that word, stubborn, was everything they had ever believed in: grit, faith, memory, and love disguised as defiance. And when night came and the valley sank into its familiar quiet, the wind would slide down from the hills, carrying the faint echo of the preacher's bell and the rhythm of hammers long fallen silent. The town breathed on, slow, steady, unremarkable, yet eternal in the only way that matters. Because in the West, there were never heroes, only those who refused to leave. By the third year after the railroad, the town finally learned what it had actually invited: not just trains, not just timetables, not just letters arriving on schedule, but a mirror. The rails didn't only carry freight, they carried comparisons: who we were, who we had become, and what we had promised one another on the worst nights when the wind shook the doors. All of it came back on those iron tracks for accounting. The first sign was small and easy to ignore, a notice tacked to the door of the old courthouse shell, a one-room structure that had served as church, school, and town hall in different seasons. Territory assessment, new valuations, it read, in neat Eastern script, beneath it, a list of names and numbers. To most, it looked like arithmetic. To a few, it looked like firewood with better grammar. People had always paid in trade, eggs for lamp oil, a side of bacon for nail kegs, 2 days of fence mending for a doctor's visit. Now the assessor spoke a language no one here had learned: valuations, arrears, liens, conveyance. It wasn't that the words were complicated, it was that they were clean. Clean words in a dirty world have a habit of cutting deep. Land that had once been defined by memory, from the cottonwood to the creek bend, from the red stone to the bluff, now gained borders in ink. Property lines tightened like belts around the ribs of people who had lived wide. What had felt infinite began to fit inside folders. At first, folks joked, "Let the assessor come. Count my tumbleweeds," a rancher said. "Charge him for each one that blows through," someone added, and laughter braided with dust. But jokes spent fast where paper accumulates, and by midsummer the laughter thinned. The sheriff, older, heavier, badge polished more than necessary, asked for patience. "Nothing to fear if you've nothing to hide," he said, as if poverty were something one could tuck beneath a floorboard. He'd always been a fair man in a world that punished fairness, but paper made him look different. A decree in his pocket gave his voice the weight of men in distant rooms. The town felt it. The reckoning wasn't just money. It was memory. The new teacher, Miss Wells's first star pupil, now grown, assigned essays called What We Owe. Children wrote about tools borrowed and never returned, water shared in the drought, bread left on porches in winter, hands that caught them when they slipped from haylofts. They wrote about funerals, how neighbors brought stew and silence, then split wood. Without being asked, they wrote about the blacksmith who disappeared, about Ezra Pike's sign, "We endure," and the preacher's edition, "We remember why." They wrote, without knowing it, a ledger more honest than any assessor's book. On Sundays, the preacher preached smaller sermons and longer pauses. He let the room hear itself breathe. "Debts come in many forms," he said one morning. "Some are paid in coin, some in sweat, some in time. Some are paid by staying when it would be easier to leave." He didn't mention names, but the room filled with them anyway. The saloon tried to stay neutral, the way water tries to stay clear in a storm. Railmen at one table, locals at another, cards between as translation. Some nights the barkeep laid a Bible under the counter and a rifle above it, and prayed he'd need neither. A boy named Thomas, 12, all elbows and intent, began copying notices from the courthouse door into a little notebook. He didn't understand what he wrote. He understood that adults looked at those papers with the faces they wore at funerals. "Why do you copy them?" Miss Wells asked when she found him on the steps, pencil nub held like a sacred instrument. "So they can't disappear," he said. "History on the frontier is a nervous animal. It runs if you don't hold it gently." When the first auction came, it arrived with polite language and a wagon team. The wagon carried a table, a chair, a ledger, a small bell, the furniture of civilization. Men gathered in hats and caution, women stood back, faces unreadable. The lot was a rectangle of earth behind the old livery. 3 fruit trees, a lean-to, and a patch where a child had once planted peas in the wrong season and called the failure a miracle anyway. The owner, a widow named Alma, had signed something she couldn't read when her husband died. Interest had grown faster than apples. When the bell rang, bid sounded like the striking of nails. No one meant to be cruel. This is important to say. Cruelty out here was usually an accident with paperwork. A rancher bought the lot and offered Alma the lean-to to sleep in until spring. He was not a villain. He was a man trying to keep his herd fed and his children in boots, but the town felt the tilt of the world in that moment. The way mercy could become a receipt if you weren't careful. That night, the preacher didn't ring the bell. He sat on the steps with Alma, counting something that wasn't money. Meanwhile, the railroad kept time, the only clock that never failed. Trains arrived and left, schedules posted with military certainty. The telegraph clicked, turning distance into Sound. A man at the station said he could send a message to Chicago in minutes. Can you send a loaf of bread? A woman asked that. He smiled, not unkindly, and went back to tapping. Commerce shifted, as winds do. The old general store found a second life selling what the new one didn't. Mended tools, used boots, advice given free. Old Turner came back to his stool by the door, eyes smaller but kinder. He didn't compete. He endured. Everything new gets tired, he told a boy admiring a bright tin coffee pot through the big store's window. Best to know what lasts. The doctor, young Harrow now, the old man watching from shade, learned to say no. That he refused to sign papers that moved people from beds to street. That he said a house was a medicine some bodies required, and wrote that prescription on scraps of brown paper that meant nothing and everything. I can't make it legal, he told the sheriff, but I can make it right. The sheriff, tired in a way leather gets tired, said nothing. Reckoning came to the church, too, not to theology. No one had the energy for doctrinal storms, but to memory. A wooden box appeared near the back pew with a note, debts of kindness, pay forward. Coins clinked into it now and then, but more often, people dropped folded slips. 2 days of roof repair for anyone who needs it, bread on Wednesdays. Watch with the sick after midnight. If a name was written, it was small, the offer was the larger script. Miss Wells turned the slips into assignments on a chalkboard titled How a Town Works. Children erased them as each task was done, then wrote new ones. They learned civics not from books, but from brooms and shovels. An O pledge recited could have taught loyalty more efficiently. A traveler, a quiet woman with a scar on her cheek and a fiddle in a cloth case, stayed at the boarding house for 2 nights and left behind her instrument for the school. She said she'd return for it when the sky forgot its old griefs. No one asked what that meant. Thomas, the boy with the notebook, learned 2 tunes and taught 3 more by ear. Music began to share the work of the bell. Not all reckonings were gentle. A fight broke out at the edge of the stockyards between a crew foreman and a local whose fence line had been redrawn by a surveyor with a ruler and no patience for wind-bent boundaries. Words became hands, hands became iron. By the time the sheriff arrived, 2 ribs had been broken, a jaw dislocated, and the town's last illusions about progress without cost had been corrected. The next morning, a meeting was called. Not in the courthouse, but in the schoolyard. The preacher stood with Miss Wells, the doctor, old Turner, the rancher who had bought Alma's lot, the station man, the assessor, and 30 others who made the town a town. No speeches, just a circle and a question. What do we owe? It took hours to list that we owe safety to those who cannot make it for themselves. We owe time to those who have spent theirs on us. We owe memory to the ones the river took and the ones the drought forgot. We owe fair prices when harvest is poor and patience when tempers are. We owe silence where shame needs cover, and noise where injustice prefers quiet. We owe work shared, not sold. When winter comes early. We owe a road that even the least of us can walk without paying a toll of dignity. The assessor wrote as quickly as he could, Eastern pen scratching Western truths. When they had finished, the list was tacked beside the new valuations notice. 2 documents. 1 town, paper can wound. It can also bind. That evening, Alma moved from the lean-to to a spare room above the saloon, rent paid by the debts of kindness box and the rancher who had bought the lot. He carried her trunk himself. No one cheered. They nodded. Reckonings rarely make noise. Autumn arrived with a clarity that felt like judgment. The air went clean, the colors honest. Harvest came up. Adequate, which in this place was a synonym for grateful. Children measured their height against corn stalks and discovered they had grown. Miss Wells let them carve their initials into the back of the schoolhouse, then made them sand the marks smooth again in spring, to practice making and unmaking the world you live in. She said, the railroad posted a new timetable. Fewer trains would stop now that a larger station had opened further west. The town read the paper like a weather report. Less traffic meant more quiet meant hearing yourselves again, your promises, your betrayals, your stubborn, ordinary courage. On the last warm evening before frost, the preacher rang the bell, and the town gathered by habit more than announcement. He didn't climb the steps to speak. He stayed among them and said, I used to preach as if heaven were a place we might trade for this one, that I don't think that anymore, that I think heaven is what you build while you're busy paying what you owe. No amen followed, just a long breath shared by many. The stars came out like old friends who had forgiven you without telling you how hard it had been. A wind moved through the cottonwood behind the church, and someone, no one remembered who, started to hum the traveling woman's tune. The notes were simple enough that even grief could remember them. Faces softened, hands unclenched. For a moment, the great arithmetic of the West, loss plus endurance plus love divided by time, resolved into a number everyone could live with. The bell did not ring again that night. That it didn't need to. The town had counted itself, and for once, the sum felt right. That in the morning, there would be more notices, more paper, more trains, more reckonings. That in the morning, fences would still need mending, and someone would be short on flour, and a child would ask a question too big for a lesson and too important to postpone. That in the morning, the sun would ascend as if nothing required courage, but in that brief, exact season, the season of reckoning, the people who stayed remembered why they had chosen to, not for glory, not for wealth, not even for safety. They stayed because staying had become the truest thing they knew how to do, and when a place recognizes the truth that keeps it standing, it learns to stand a little straighter. So the town did. That it stood, counted, paid, forgave, and wrote the rest on slips of paper tucked into a wooden box at the back of a room where even silence could be trusted, and the rails, having delivered the ledger, carried it away into the horizon, where all debts, given time and love enough, are finally translated back into grace. By the fourth winter, even the wind seemed older. It carried the same dust, but slower, like it had learned the town's rhythm of breathing. Snow came late and melted early, leaving behind puddles that reflected a sky too pale to promise anything. Life no longer changed in grand gestures. It shifted in inches. In the quiet way people began sitting closer, sharing silence the way they once shared bread. The worst years had passed, but survival had left marks that didn't heal so much as settle. Children who had been born during the flood were now running barefoot through the fields, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Why did they stay? Why didn't they leave when the trains came? The adults gave practical answers. There was land to tend, work to do, graves to mind, but the truth was harder to name. Leaving had never felt like freedom, only another way of losing something you couldn't carry. Miss Wells kept her school running through the cold months, stoking the stove with broken fence posts and bits of old wagons. She taught her students to read, but more importantly, to listen. Every week, she chose one story from the notebook she called The Ones Who Stayed. Some were hers, some were from others: the blacksmith, the widow Alma, Ezra Pike, even the preacher. She read them slowly, letting the fire crackle between sentences. The children always sat stillest during the stories about the floods and droughts, about how their parents had built walls with their bare hands and kept each other warm through fear alone. One afternoon, she asked them to write letters to the future. Pretend someone 100 years from now will find them, she said. What would you want them to know about this place? The letters were simple. The sky is big. We plant every spring even if we're tired. Our mothers are brave. We don't forget. She kept them all, folded into the pages of her notebook like small prayers made of paper. The preacher's sermons grew shorter. He no longer tried to save souls. He only tried to remind them they had won. Sometimes he would stand at the front of the church, hands behind his back, and say, "You're doing fine," before sitting down again. No one complained. People didn't need promises anymore. They needed permission to rest. At night, he would walk the road to the river, listening to the whisper of water on stone. The floods had changed its course, but the sound was the same. He would kneel, scoop a handful, and let it slip through his fingers like the years, still moving. He'd say to himself, still forgiving. He had stopped wearing his collar years ago. It had become too tight. The town had new faces now. Children of the newcomers, rail workers who had decided to stay, women who ran the boarding house and bakery with quiet authority. It was the women, in truth, who kept the town alive. They organized the harvest festivals, the sewing circles, the school repairs, and the quiet rescues no one spoke of. A loaf left by a door, a blanket slipped through a cracked window, a letter written for someone who couldn't. Alma, the widow whose land had once been auctioned, now kept the debts of kindness box. She emptied it every Sunday and pinned the new offers on the church wall: shoeing for an old mule, firewood cut for winter, reading lessons for grown men. When someone asked her why she still did it, she said, "Because kindness gets tired too, you have to keep feeding it, or it lies down." The young Dr. Harrow worked tirelessly, but he was learning a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from curing bodies while watching spirits starve. He once told the preacher, "I can stop a fever, but I can't stop loneliness." The preacher smiled sadly. "That's because loneliness doesn't want a cure, it wants company." Progress continued its slow crawl westward. A telegraph office opened near the station, and for a while, the operator became the town's most envied man. He could reach beyond the horizon with his fingertips. Every click meant connection, but after a few months, the sound became background noise. Another kind of silence, sharper than before. The young started dreaming of leaving. They wanted cities with lights that didn't need stars, music that came from more than fiddles and wind. Some packed up quietly, boarding the evening train with suitcases borrowed from neighbors. Others stayed, but you could see it in their eyes. They were already halfway gone. Miss Wells noticed it first. One morning, she found the chalkboard empty. The children had written nothing for her lesson on community. When she asked why, Thomas, now 16, stood and said, "Maybe community is something you have until you know what else is out there." It wasn't said with anger. It was said with sorrow. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "The hardest part of staying is forgiving those who leave." The saloon had turned into something else, not a bar, not a church, but a waiting room for change. Men came less to drink than to talk about the strange new world arriving by train. There were rumors of electric lamps, phonographs, even moving pictures. Someone claimed they'd seen a photograph where the people smiled. "No one smiles in a photograph," said old Turner, "not unless they're lying." Everyone laughed, but not for long. Harrow the doctor began studying books from back east, sent by a friend who remembered him from school. He wanted to learn about new surgeries, new medicines that might finally make a difference. But the more he read, the more foreign it all seemed. "These books talk about progress like it's a cure," he said one evening, "but no one writes about what it costs." The preacher nodded. "They will," he said, "they always do. But only after the cost is paid." By early spring, the snow melted into deep mud. The river rose again, not to destroy but to remind. The earth still owned them. It could still take everything back if it wanted. Miss Wells gathered her students by the bank. She made them plant willows. "Thin, green, fragile roots are a promise," she told them. "They say, 'I will stay even when the wind tries to move me.'" The children didn't understand fully, but they planted carefully, their hands trembling as if the branches might feel pain. That night, the preacher walked past the same spot. He saw the rows of young trees bending in the wind and whispered, "Faith looks like that sometimes, fragile, bending, but alive." When the moon came up, the whole valley shimmered silver. You could see the tracks of deer, the prints of children, and the long shadow of the church steeple pointing east, toward everything they'd left behind and everything they still refused to give up. The next morning, Miss Wells found another letter slipped under the schoolhouse door. It wasn't signed. It read, "If you ever wonder whether it mattered, it did. If you ever think the quiet was wasted, it wasn't. If you ever forget why you stayed, look at the trees." She folded it into her notebook beside the children's letters to the future. When she looked out the window, the willows were still standing, their roots drinking from the same stubborn earth that had outlasted everything else. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that endurance wasn't just survival, it was a kind of faith too. Spring came with a kind of gentleness that made people suspicious. After years of storms and reckonings, a calm sky felt unnatural, the earth looked rested, the grass even dared to grow early, but no one trusted it. In a town built on caution, peace was something you tested before believing in. The trains came less often now, each whistle echoed longer, like the sound had to search harder to find ears still listening. With fewer travelers, the station became a place of ghosts, a wooden platform where Letters waited longer, and names were called out into silence. Old Turner stopped opening his store on Sundays. Nothing new worth selling, he said, but sometimes he sat by the window anyway, just to watch the road, a habit older than reason. The preacher began to write again that he filled pages with thoughts he never preached, about mercy, about boredom, about the quiet forms of love that hold a town together long after purpose fades. That he wrote that forgiveness wasn't something you gave to others, it was what you decided to live with. He didn't sign the pages, just folded them into the cracks of the pews, like seeds that might sprout into comfort later. That summer, a rumor started. The government was sending men to survey the land again. Some said it meant new rail expansion. Others whispered about taxes, conscription, or worse, relocation. Fear didn't need proof here. It only needed memory. At the saloon, maps were drawn on napkins, arguments flared, and the word change began to sound like thunder. Again, but the surveyors never came. The rumor had been nothing but wind. Still, the fear stayed. Fear doesn't need its source to survive, the preacher told Miss Wells. Rumors are the devil's handwriting. She replied, maybe, but sometimes they tell us what people really want to say. He laughed softly. In that case, everyone here must be begging not to be forgotten. Alma's hands had begun to tremble. She was still tending the debts of kindness box, but it took her longer to sort the notes. Her hair had gone silver and soft, and when the children saw her walking to church each morning, they whispered like she was part of a story, something between legend and prayer. One Sunday, she didn't come. The preacher went to her home, a small upstairs room above the saloon, window facing the tracks. She was sitting at the table, sorting through the last of the notes. Her voice was clear, though her hands shook. I'm almost done, Reverend. There's fewer debts now. He smiled. There always are, Miss Alma, before the world starts counting again. She looked out the window toward the rails. Then I suppose it's time for me to rest before the next reckoning. The preacher nodded. Neither spoke again. When she passed a week later, the box was found empty except for one folded slip. It read, to whoever comes after, remember, kindness has no ledger. It keeps its own books. The preacher placed it under the church bell. He didn't ring it that day. As summer deepened, the town felt smaller. The children had grown into young adults, restless and curious. The fields were tended by fewer hands. The laughter at the well quieter. Some evenings, you could walk from one end of town to the other and count every sound, the creak of a sign in the wind, the drip of water from a pump, the soft click of the telegraph with no one waiting on the other end. Miss Wells kept teaching, but she'd begun adding lessons of silence. Not everything worth knowing comes with a sound, she said. She would have her students sit for 5 minutes without speaking, listening only to what the world was doing. At first, they fidgeted, but eventually, they learned silence, too, can be a language, one that teaches patience, humility, and the truth about how little we control. Thomas, now nearly grown, had become her helper. He repaired desks, brought wood, and once a week read aloud from the ones who stayed. His voice had deepened, but his eyes still held the same hunger to understand. Sometimes he asked Miss Wells, do you think it's braver to stay or to go? She never answered directly. It's brave to know which one is yours, she'd say. That summer, he built a small bench near the willow trees they'd planted years ago. He sat there after lessons, watching how the wind moved through them, how some branches bent low and others resisted. It reminded him of people. When Miss Wells asked what he thought about while sitting there, he said, I'm waiting to see which one of us breaks first, the trees or me. She didn't laugh. She knew the kind of heart that said such things. The preacher grew quieter as the months passed. His voice, once a steady bell, became a kind of soft gravel, rough, honest, tired. He spent more time at the river again, leaving footprints that always washed away before morning. He'd begun writing short notes instead of sermons, and leaving them in people's doors. You're forgiven. You did your best. You're not alone. No one ever saw him deliver them, but everyone knew it was him. The town began to answer. Notes appeared on his own door. You too, rest now. By autumn, the fields burned gold again, and the harvest was good, better than expected. The town gathered for the festival, though it was smaller than before. Children danced, the fiddle returned, and the laughter, though quieter, was genuine. The preacher stood near the edge of the firelight, watching as Miss Wells twirled a young girl in her arms. Thomas played the fiddle, the same one the traveler had left years ago, when the song ended. The preacher raised his voice, not in sermon, but in toast to the ones who left, he said, and to the ones who stayed long enough to miss them. The crowd cheered softly. It wasn't joy exactly, it was recognition. Later that night, as the fire burned down, Thomas found the preacher sitting alone, his hands clasped, eyes reflecting the last embers. "Are we finished?" Thomas asked. The preacher smiled faintly. "Nothing finishes, it just turns quiet for a while." That winter came early and harsh. Snow fell heavy and stayed. The willows bent low under the weight, their roots holding the frozen ground like promise. The town huddled together again. In the school, the saloon, the church, everywhere smelled of smoke, soup, and old stories. Miss Wells read aloud each evening, her voice echoing softly through the lamplight. She read from the ones who stayed, but also from her students' letters to the future. When she finished, she would look out the window, watching the snow fall over the tracks, and whisper the same line to herself every night: "We are still here." And though the trains had all but stopped, sometimes, far in the distance, a faint whistle could be heard, as if the world were answering back. When spring returned, it did so quietly, not as a promise, but as a memory repeating itself. Snow melted without ceremony, the river found its curve again, and the fields exhaled a damp, earthy breath, like a tired animal waking. No one cheered. They had learned that renewal always brought its bill due later. Miss Wells noticed first that the bell did not ring. The preacher's lamp was still burning in the morning, a weak halo behind the curtain. Thomas and two others pushed the door. There he sat in the chair, hands folded over a single sheet of paper, a faint smile holding to his face as if it had simply forgotten to leave. He had not suffered, he had stopped. The note on his lap read, "If you hear the bell again, it means you remembered to listen." They carried him to the cottonwood by the river, the one that had bent through storms without breaking. The town gathered in clothes that did not match and grief that did. No sermon, not really. Miss Wells opened the preacher's old notebook and read, "Faith is not noise or light or certainty. It is what remains after fear refuses to. It is the work of getting up." When dusk fell, the women of the town, Alma among them, lifted the bell down from its beam, scrubbed it with ash and salt, mended the frayed rope with strips of an old Sunday dress, and hung it again. They said nothing, but their hands made a kind of prayer. The bell sounded once. No one pulled. A low, round tone the wind might have shaped, gratitude disguised as weather. Life resumed as it always had, by chores. The saloon opened. The schoolhouse filled. The doctor's lantern burned late, yet under everything, a slow, even rhythm took hold. Not triumph, not resignation, something gentler, permission. Thomas began leaving notes the way the preacher once did, not verses, not orders, just small sentences people could carry like flint. "You matter, eat first, argue after, the hard day will end, and so will the good one, keep both in their place." Folks slipped them into Bibles, pegged them beneath mirrors, folded them into the lining of coats. Hope learned to wear handwriting. That spring he also took on the river route at dawn, checking the banks where the willows Miss Wells had planted had grown into a thin green choir. He counted them like beads. 21 saplings turned trees, trunks scarred by winter, roots drunk with stubborn water. He spoke to them as if they were students. "You bent. You did not break. Good." The wind answered in leaves. Miss Wells lasted one more year with a teacher's pride and a patient body. She kept lessons short and rest long, but the children leaned in as if distance itself were a subject she could still explain. When her voice thinned, they finished her sentences. She smiled and let them. "Teaching," she whispered once, "is the art of becoming unnecessary." That last winter, she pulled treasures from the cupboard, ink-blotted slates, a map with the corners torn away, a stack of letters the children had written to the future. She read them again. "The sky is big. We plant even when we're tired. Our mothers are brave. We don't forget." Then she added one of her own in a neat, slanted hand. if you found this, then we kept our promise long enough for you to make yours. She tucked it into her notebook, the ones who stayed, and in the margin wrote a final lesson. Continue. 2 months later, on a linen-colored morning, she died without drama. Thomas rang the bell, 3 slow tolls, spaced for breathing. The sound traveled the length of the valley, struck the rails, and came back softer, as if the earth were humming along. They buried her beside the cottonwood, near the preacher, within reach of the river's confession. On the schoolhouse step, Thomas carved her name where Ezra's had been, so children would step over both on their way to learn. The town shrank and steadied. New children filled benches worn smooth by older restless knees. A young woman took the bakery, a retired brakeman took the ferry rope. In floods, the train still came, but less. It whistled like a memory now. When it stopped, no one ran. They listened, named the sound, and let it pass through them. Thomas taught with Miss Wells's notebook open on the desk. That he added lessons in wide, patient script. There is strength in gentleness. Endurance is a kind of song, don't sing it so loud you can't hear others join. You don't have to be seen to make something last. A town is a bargain. You give up distance to gain belonging. On the anniversary of the preacher's passing, he walked the class down to the river. They read fragments from both notebooks, and the children recited what they could not yet understand, that forgiveness is not for the past but for the day after, that fear is a tool until it becomes a master, that staying is not a smaller courage than leaving. When they finished, Thomas closed the book and said, "This is not an ending. This is a long breath." That year the winter came late, stayed short, and left politely. Between its leaving and spring's decision to arrive, a photographer returned, the same thin man with the wooden camera and the hat that pretended not to be tired. He asked for a picture of the soul of the place. They gave him what they had, people lined like fence posts, hands quiet, eyes steady. Ezra's bench showed in the corner, the bell's rope leaned into the frame like a line under a difficult sentence. When the picture dried, the town studied their faces, not proud, not ashamed, simply present. "Looks like we're telling the truth," Alma said, almost laughing. Alma's hands shook more by summer, but the debts of kindness box kept its appetite. She sorted the slips at her window over the tracks, firewood stacked, 2 afternoons, shoes for a child, cobbled and ready, sit with the fearful, midnights available. When words doubled, she underlined the second line and wrote, again, "Kindness sleeps if you stop feeding it." She told Thomas, "It wakes hungry." She died in her chair one evening, 2 slips pinched beneath her thumb. Thomas placed them under the bell. They were fulfilled within a week. The reckoning season ended not with a verdict but with comprehension. Paper stayed, ledger stayed, taxes learned the roads, but so did mercy. The school kept a cupboard labeled borrowed time, a basket of chores you could take when you owed hours you didn't have. The saloon kept a shelf for letters unclaimed, read aloud on winter nights to turn loneliness into a group project. The doctor, young Harrow now, his sleeves rolled forever, wrote impossible prescriptions on scraps. 2 nights of uninterrupted sleep, someone to wait while you cried that he couldn't make them legal. The town made them happen. Wildflowers spread their courage along the tracks each spring, yellow, white, pink. A seam of softness through iron. Children learned their names and argued about which color meant what, yellow for staying, white for forgiving, pink for remembering without breaking. No one corrected them. On the hill above town, the sign Ezra carved still held, "We endure." The preacher's hand had added, "We remember why." Now Thomas lifted the board, sanded a place below, and cut 2 smaller words with slow care. "We continue." Under those, at the insistence of the class, the tiniest line, "We teach." He set the sign back into its posts, and the wind tried the new syllables, pleased at how they fit the mouth of the valley. And still the world moved. The big station farther west stole most of the timetables. The telegraph clicked like a grasshopper nobody chased, but sometimes, especially on cold evenings when fire drew people into one room, the town felt even larger than the map suggested. To be small is not to be lesser, it is to be nearer. On a late summer night, they held a gathering not named a festival, Names make things nervous, lanterns in trees, tables made of doors across sawhorses, a fiddle tuned between jokes, they ate, they told the oldest stories like they had just happened, and when the children asked for something new, the women told the truth. That is what the new is out here, the old told until it finally fits the day. Thomas stood at the edge of the light and listened that he counted all the sounds that meant home, a spoon against tin, a dry laugh, boots slow across porch boards, and the river rehearsing forgiveness in the dark. That he thought of his notes, of the notebooks, of the sign, and felt the old fear lift like a coat he had outgrown. Later, when the lanterns burned low, he walked to the schoolhouse and set the notebook on the desk that he wrote for whoever would come after. If you find this, it's because the town still stands somewhere inside you, maybe not in boards and doors, maybe in the way you put water on to boil before you speak, or in how you count people's breaths when storms come. That we were not heroes. We were those who stayed until staying became a craft. That if you must leave, take this with you. If you stay, add to it. Either way, remember the bell is only a bell if you are listening. That he closed the book. Outside, the wind moved the rope once, a small sound, almost not a sound at all. Enough. Autumn wrote its honest colors across the fields. Children measured themselves against willows that remembered them when they were shorter. The doctor slept through one night without being woken and called it medicine. Alma's box found a new keeper who did not try to take her place. The saloon retired the shelf of unclaimed letters. There were fewer now, or maybe the town had learned to claim each other instead. Winter arrived without cruelty. Snow made the rails a line of milk in the moonlight. That a train crossed once, whistled once, and disappeared into a distance no one envied. No one waved. They listened to be sure the sound had a place to go. In the schoolhouse, Thomas lit the lamp and began the lesson. Today we will practice silence, he said, and then we will practice what silence teaches. They sat still long enough to hear the world thinking. When the time was up, he asked what they learned. A small hand rose, that the bell could ring and we'd know. He smiled. That is enough for today. After class he locked the door, stepped into the clear night, and looked down at the town. Smoke from chimneys rose in calm threads, stars held their ground. He said the words aloud to make them true. We endure. We remember why. We continue. We teach. The valley accepted the oath and folded it into its echoes. He walked home along the river path. By the cottonwood, he paused, put a palm to the scarred bark, and thanked it for not breaking. The river, slow as a long breath, approved. From far off, maybe the ridge, maybe the next county, maybe memory, a thin bell note drifted. He did not turn to find it. He only listened until the sound ended, and in that ending, he understood the preacher's note at last. The bell is a promise kept by ears. He went inside, set the lamp on the table, and wrote one last line for the day. We are still here. Outside, the town exhaled with him, a small, shared breath, the sound a place makes when it knows it has become itself. The last generation. By the time another 20 years had passed, the town had changed in ways that only silence could measure. Buildings sagged a little, colors faded, but the sound of footsteps on the boardwalk still echoed with purpose. Time had not defeated them, only softened the edges, like wind. Smoothing the corners of old stones. Thomas was no longer young. His hair had gone white at the temples, and his back carried a slow curve, but his hands were steady and his eyes still clear. He walked the same path to the schoolhouse every morning, passing by the cottonwood, the river bend, and the small sign at the hill that read, We endure. We remember why. We continue. We teach. Sometimes, he touched the sign with his fingertips, the way one checks a pulse. He said it kept him honest. The children who filled his classroom were not the same kind who once arrived barefoot, mud on their faces and dreams of the next meal. These new ones were born into a quieter hardship, the kind made of questions, not hunger. They wanted to know what came before them, but also whether any of it still mattered. Teacher, one boy asked, why do we still live here if the world out there is easier? Thomas smiled. Because the world out there forgets things too fast, he said, and we remember slow. He didn't mean it as wisdom. It was just the truth he'd learned from listening to the land breathe. The cottonwood had grown enormous now, its trunk twisted like a great hand gripping the earth. Every spring, the children measured their height against it, stretching to see who came closest to the carved names near its base: Ezra Pike, Miss Wells, Alma, and now Thomas himself. He hadn't carved it. Someone else had done it for him after a fever nearly took him the year before. He pretended not to know who, but he suspected one of his older students, the quiet girl with ink stains on her fingers. The river had changed too. It no longer roared in spring, it hummed. Its banks were lined with willows now thick enough to shade an entire picnic. Couples sat there on Sundays, talking about crops and books and small dreams that no longer sounded impossible. Thomas liked to walk there after class. He would sit on the same bench he had built decades ago and read from Miss Wells's old notebook. The pages were fragile, the ink nearly gone in places, but the words still breathed. He read them aloud sometimes, not for anyone else, but for the valley itself. The sky is big. We plant even when we're tired. We don't forget. He whispered the last line twice. The world didn't answer, but the river seemed to listen. The town itself had grown into a kind of stillness that felt earned. There were fewer houses, but every one of them stood upright, freshly painted, as if to prove that age could still look proud. The telegraph office had long closed, its wires now home to birds that had never heard a message sent. The station roof sagged, and the timetable nailed to the post had turned blank with weather. Trains came rarely now, maybe twice a month, and when they did, no one ran to meet them. They listened, smiled, and went on with their day. The sound of progress had turned into a kind of comfort. In the evenings, the townsfolk gathered at the church steps, though few called it church anymore. It was simply the hall, a place where people brought what the day had left them: a story, a loaf of bread, a piece of news, a silence to share. Sometimes, when the light was right and the air smelled of dust and lilac, they sang the old hymns without instruments. Voices alone, rough, uneven, beautiful. Thomas said it sounded like the earth trying to remember its own melody. That summer, one of his former students returned, a woman now, with a child of her own and city dust still clinging to her boots. Her name was Ruth, and she had left 15 years earlier to see what the world was like. Now she stood at the edge of the river, her son tossing pebbles into the water. Thomas approached quietly. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked. Ruth smiled without turning. "Yes," she said. "And I found out it doesn't stay found for long." They walked the river path together. She told him of cities filled with noise, of lights that never dimmed enough to see the stars, of people who hurried even when they had nowhere to go. "Out there," she said, "no one waits for the wind to change, they just change without it." Thomas nodded. "It's easier that way." Ruth looked at him. "Do you think easier is better?" He didn't answer right away. He watched her son try to catch minnows in the shallows. Then he said softly, "Easier forgets faster. Better remembers longer." Ruth laughed quietly, the sound like her mother's used to be, half joy, half ache. "I suppose remembering is what this place does best." Thomas looked toward the hills. "No," he said. "It's what it teaches." When autumn came, the air carried a clean chill that made the sky feel taller. Thomas began coughing more, but he still walked to school every morning, carrying Miss Wells's notebook wrapped in cloth. He taught fewer lessons now, more stories. He told the children about the time the preacher refused to close the church, about Alma and her kindness box, about the photographer who came twice and never smiled once. He told them about Ezra Pike, who carved words into wood instead of stone because he believed everything should have the right to change. "Why do you tell us the same stories again and again?" a girl asked one day. Thomas smiled. "Because someday you'll tell them, and they'll sound new." He looked out the window then, watching leaves drift past the glass. "The stories don't age," he said, "only the tellers do." That winter was gentle, as if the world wanted to let him rest. The snow fell soft and slow, covering every track but leaving the roofs bare enough to breathe. One evening, he lit the stove, poured tea, and sat by the window of the schoolhouse. The lamp flickered, The wind moved the bell rope outside just enough for a soft note to hum through the room that he closed his eyes that he could almost hear them all again. Miss Wells, the preacher, Alma, Ezra, their voices layered like seasons that he whispered into the dim light, "We're still here." Outside, the river shimmered under moonlight and the willows bent just slightly, as if nodding in agreement. After the railroad came, the frontier didn't end, it changed its language. The trails were quieter now, but the rhythm of survival remained, measured not in miles traveled but in days endured. Each town settled into its own slow heartbeat. That it was no longer a land of pioneers, but of keepers, people who stayed behind to build what others had only passed through. Each morning began with sound, the creak of a windmill, the first strike of the blacksmith's hammer, the murmur of cattle waiting for feed. There was no alarm clock in these towns. The light itself told people when to rise, and the cold reminded them why. Fires were coaxed from half-sleeping embers, coffee brewed strong enough to feel like courage, and work began long before the sun had fully decided to appear. The land demanded attention, soil was thin, stubborn, but still alive. Men worked it with iron plows that broke as often as they turned. That a good harvest was never promised, only borrowed. Some years the corn stood tall, the beans generous, and the barns filled with dry hay that smelled like victory. Other years, drought baked the earth into stone, and families stared at empty fields as if waiting for forgiveness. Women carried an invisible weight through all of it. They mended, baked, taught, and healed, often without leaving the same 12 yards of ground. That in a single day they could birth a child, patch a roof, and make bread from the last handful of flour. Soap was boiled from lye and ash, candles from tallow and patience. They dyed fabric with onion skins, stitched clothes from feed sacks, and brewed tonics that kept fevers away through winters that never asked for mercy. They kept the houses warm, but more importantly, they kept people believing warmth was possible. Children were part of the labor force. As soon as they could reach a handle or carry a pail. By 8, they could stack wood in neat rows, milk a cow, or run a message across town without getting lost. School came after chores, and learning was done by lamplight when hands were too tired to grip tools. Few complained. Work wasn't punishment, it was participation in survival. By the 1880s, the railroad had tied the region to the rest of the country, but it also tied people to schedules they never asked for. Trains brought goods, yes, fabric from Chicago, coffee from New Orleans, nails from Pittsburgh, but they also brought the weight of comparison. The towns saw what others had, and wanted it. That it was the beginning of modern hunger, not for food, but for more. Markets began to appear beside saloons and post offices. A man could buy sugar by the pound, or sell his crops by the wagon load, but prices changed faster than weather. 1 week a barrel of flour might cost $2, the next, $5. People learned to live not by what they earned, but by what they could endure. Trade fairs and harvest socials became the bright spots of the year. Once or twice each season, wagons came from neighboring towns, bringing music, tools, gossip, and the sense that they weren't alone in their struggle. There were contests for the largest pumpkin, the fastest horse, and the most creative pie. Judged by whoever could still taste sugar. For a few hours, laughter was louder than fatigue, and the world felt generous again. Not everyone who worked the frontier spoke the same language. Immigrants filled the labor lines, Irish on the rail crews, Germans in the breweries and farms, Chinese workers in the mountain passes, Mexican cowhands along the southern trails. Each brought their craft, their cooking, their songs. They shaped the frontier more than history books would later admit. At night, when the wind shifted, you could hear a mix of accents around the campfires, different tongues telling the same truth. Work was the only border that mattered. Among them, bonds formed quietly. A ranch hand might share tobacco with a miner, a widow might feed both with bread she couldn't spare. There was no language for generosity, it simply happened. When someone's barn burned, the whole town came with hammers and laughter to raise it again. By sundown, they called it a barn raising, but it was really a ceremony of belonging. Communication was slow but sacred. The post rider was as important as the preacher. A single letter could hold a season's worth of courage. people waited months for news from kin who had gone east or for word of loved ones lost to the mines. When a letter finally came, it was read aloud again and again until the paper wore thin. Sometimes, neighbors gathered just to listen to someone else's mail. Because hope shared sounded louder, the telegraph came next, its clicking like distant rain. Few could read the code, but everyone knew its rhythm meant the world was moving somewhere beyond them. For many, that was enough. Health remained fragile. A cough could last the season, wound could turn fatal within days. Doctors were rare and often younger than their patients. They arrived on horseback with saddlebags of alcohol, gauze, and faith. There were no hospitals, only homes with clean sheets and quiet prayers. What saved most people was not medicine but attention, neighbors sitting through the night, wives keeping the fire alive, and mothers boiling broth when all else failed. Winter magnified everything. Loneliness, need, and grace. When snow buried the roads, families became islands of warmth in a frozen sea. Chimneys smoked steady through the dark months. Inside, people mended clothes, carved wood, and told the same stories their grandparents had told before them. The repetition was not dullness. It was proof they had made it another year. Spring returned like forgiveness. Mud swallowed the wagon wheels again, but no one cursed it. It meant the earth still worked. Chickens pecked the thawed ground. Seedlings tested the air, and children ran barefoot through puddles as if joy itself had a season. In these months, everything felt temporary but alive. By summer, life resumed its ordinary miracles. Bread rose, wells filled, babies laughed, and horses kicked dust across the sunset. The work was endless, but so was the will to keep doing it. As the year closed, families gathered to take stock, of grain, of livestock, of luck. They marked the passing of time not by calendars, but by what had survived the season. Tools unbroken, friendships unforgotten, and roofs still standing. Someone would always say, "We got through another one." And everyone would nod that it wasn't triumph, exactly that it was something quieter, something truer, the shared understanding that continuing was enough out here. Work was not simply a means to live. It was the shape of life itself. The earth gave nothing freely, but it always answered effort with memory, and so the people worked not to conquer the land, but to belong to it a little more each year. Because in the end, survival was never just endurance, it was faith in motion, the faith that tomorrow would ask again, and they would answer the same way they always had. We continued. If you live long enough on the frontier, you learn that the land remembers, not in words, but in rhythm. A cycle of wind and dust, of growth and return. Every ridge, every patch of grass, every stone along the river carries a quiet testimony that it has seen more than anyone alive can recall. It remembers the centuries before fences, before towns, before the first map tried to tame what couldn't be measured. The river was the oldest voice. It told its story in ripples and floods, a steady hymn of movement. Even when frozen in winter, it hummed below the ice, whispering, "Wait, wait." In spring it broke open again with thunder, claiming back what had been borrowed, feeding the soil with all the patience of forgiveness. Children grew up knowing its moods the way others knew seasons. They could tell by its color whether rain had fallen far upstream, whether trout would rise that morning, or whether the earth had shifted deep beneath the current. The river taught them to read signs, not letters on a page, but the subtle alphabet of life. Farmers depended on its generosity but feared its judgment. When the river rose too high, it erased months of labor in a single night. Fields became lakes, barns floated like boats, chickens, fences, and memory all swept downstream. When it sank too low, the wells went dry, and cattle wandered until their ribs showed like maps. No man could ever master it. They could only learn its moods and hope to be forgiven. The floods of 1889 were remembered for decades. It rained for 9 days straight, and the river rose higher than any could recall. Bridges vanished, grain stores dissolved into mud, yet when the storm ended, the same water left behind fertile black silt, a strange gift born of destruction. That was the nature of the land, cruel in the short term, merciful in the long one. Drought brought the opposite cruelty. The sun burned everything hollow, and even the wind seemed to scrape the fields raw. People placed bowls of water outside for birds too weak to fly, prayers were whispered not in churches but to clouds that refused to answer, men stared at the sky until their necks ached, hoping for a single dark line on the horizon. Sometimes, when rain finally came, they laughed and cried in the same breath, thankful, embarrassed, human. The seasons defined the soul of the West. Spring was muddy hope, messy, loud, alive. Summer was hard, bright and cruel, a test of patience and skin. Autumn smelled of wood smoke and gratitude, and winter was the keeper of secrets. It was the time when people faced themselves. The cold stripped everything, noise, pride, pretending. All that was left was endurance and each other. Inside the small houses, stoves glowed orange, casting shadows that danced like old memories on the walls. Women mended, men carved, children whispered. Outside, wolves sang into the frozen dark, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. Those nights felt endless, and perhaps that was the point. Time slowed just enough for people to remember that they were part of something larger. When the first thaw came, it always began quietly. A drip from the eaves, a creak in the ice, a single drop sliding into motion. Soon the whole valley was a chorus of water, as if the land itself sighed in relief. People opened their doors to let the smell of wet earth inside. It was the scent of another chance. Animals marked the seasons as clearly as calendars. Deer moved down from the hills, geese traced their silver routes across the morning sky, and coyotes prowled the edge of the town, bold but never cruel. Even the horses seemed to understand the rhythm, heads low in summer heat, tails flicking against invisible time. Nature was not separate from the people here. It was the conversation they lived inside. The settlers learned to read that language, the call of a crow before rain, the sudden stillness before wind, the way the river bent its reflection when storms were near. These were signs as real as any newspaper headline. They didn't need science to tell them when to plant or rest. The land spoke first. They only learned how to listen. By the 1890s, telegraph wires ran parallel to the river. The world was talking faster now. Clicks of metal carried messages from one coast to another, while below, the river still carried only silence and time. Some said it was progress, others called it noise, but the river never argued. It simply went on, the original messenger that needed no translation. Travelers along the new bridges sometimes stopped halfway, looking down through the planks. They said it felt like staring into memory, a moving mirror that showed every version of the past at once. That if you dropped a stone, it vanished quickly, but the rings it made stayed visible long after. That was how life felt here. What you did disappeared, but what it meant kept moving outward. Death, too, became part of the landscape. Graves were marked with wood, not marble. The wind erased names, but the earth remembered the weight of those who rested there. Wildflowers grew where stories ended, and sometimes, a piece of river driftwood was placed like a cross. It was said that souls followed the current downstream, carried to the great waters beyond. The living took comfort in that idea. It made loss feel like travel, not disappearance. In the oldest part of the cemetery, a sign still stood that read, "Return to the dust." But never in silence. No one knew who had written it, but everyone agreed it felt true. And yet, through all the change, the land remained patient. When new towns rose, when factories sent their smoke toward the clouds, when the telegraph was replaced by the first electric lights, the river still ran, carrying mud, memory, and meaning in the same direction. The land didn't care who claimed it. It only cared how they treated it. Those who stayed longest learned this: nature forgets nothing, but it forgives quietly. The wind that tore roofs in spring was the same wind that cooled faces in summer. The rain that drowned fields was the same that brought wheat tall enough to hide a child. There was no revenge in nature, only return. At dusk, the river turned to glass. The last light lingered on its surface like a kept promise. You could see the reflection of the mountains, the trees, and sometimes, if you waited long enough, the faces of those who had lived and gone. Shadows made of memory. People came less often now. There were other distractions, machines, cities, clocks, but sometimes a traveler, weary of noise, would wander to the riverbank and listen, and if he stayed long enough, he might hear what the land had been saying all along. That time is not a line, but a circle made of water. that everything lost returns, though never in the same shape, and that the earth, patient and vast, remembers every act of care, because in the end, it is not people who keep history, it is the land, and the river, still moving, still remembering, still singing its endless song of survival. By the turn of the century, the West was no longer wild, just wide. The land hadn't changed as much as the people had, the guns had quieted, the trails had names, and maps no longer had blank spaces where imagination used to live, but the wind still carried dust from the old days, and if you listened closely, you could still hear the echo of wagon wheels under the hum of telegraph wires. Electric light began to reach the smaller towns. A few homes glowed faintly at night, as if the stars had come closer to rest. Children called it magic, elders called it unnecessary. Some said the light took away the beauty of darkness, others said it simply revealed how much dust there had always been. Progress was welcomed and doubted in the same breath. With the new century came new rhythms. Factory goods replaced handwork tools. A bar of soap could now be bought instead of boiled, a shirt ordered by catalog instead of stitched at home. Yet even as life became easier, something essential began to fade, the intimacy between effort and result. The land no longer demanded daily negotiation. Machines began to speak louder than weather. People had to learn how to listen again. The young talked about cities, streets that never turned to mud, jobs that didn't depend on rain, and evenings filled with noise instead of wind. Some left. Their absence was a kind of silence the town had never known. Letters arrived for a while, then stopped. And no one blamed them. The frontier had always been about movement. Only the direction changed. Those who stayed learned the value of slowness. They repaired rather than replaced, walked rather than rushed, and trusted the sky to keep its promises. They spoke less, but when they did, their words carried the weight of seasons. In the evenings, people gathered outside rather than in. There was less to discuss and more to remember. Old stories became the new entertainment. Someone would point to a tree or a ridge and say, "That's where the storm split the wagon," or, "That's where the first school burned, and the second was built from the ashes." These weren't tales of glory, they were instructions on how to stay human. Children listened, not always understanding, but sensing that the stories mattered. They learned that endurance had once been the only wealth, that kindness could save more lives than medicine, and that silence itself was a skill. They would need those lessons again someday, though none yet knew it. Seasons still ruled. Spring remained a gamble, summer, a labor, autumn, a sigh of relief, winter, a reminder that nothing stays green forever. The older folk began to notice that the storms came differently now, shorter, sharper, less predictable. The river ran thinner in some years, thicker in others. The land was shifting under the weight of human plans. But even change moved slowly out here. Patience was still the oldest law. Around 1910, the railroad company announced it would cut the smaller routes. The town would lose its weekly train. Some feared the end of everything. Others saw it as a kind of peace. When the final engine came through, the whole town gathered by the tracks. No speeches, no brass band, just hats held in hand, and faces turned toward the horizon. The whistle blew once, long and low, a sound full of endings and gratitude. The echo hung in the valley long after the smoke had faded. For weeks afterward, people swore they could still hear it at night, the ghost of progress wandering back home without the train. The town became slower still. Mail came by cart, news by rumor, and time by sunlight. The pace fit the place. Gardens replaced store shelves. Handwriting replaced telegraph clicks. People began measuring distance not in miles, but in conversations. The blacksmith's son opened a workshop that fixed both tools and clocks. That he said they were the same thing, both ways of keeping time from breaking completely. The preacher's granddaughter taught reading to the children, but she used stories of wind and wheat instead of kings and crowns. Everyone added something small to what remained, as if tending the memory of the land was a shared inheritance. By the 1920s, photographs had begun to replace stories. People sent postcards instead of letters, and a snapshot could travel faster than memory. But no picture ever captured the sound of wind through grass, or the feel of morning frost on wood. The land refused to be flattened into image. It stayed three-dimensional, alive, patient, some evenings, when the sun set red behind the cottonwoods, the sky looked exactly as it had 50 years earlier. That was comfort enough. The world beyond could rush and roar. But here, time still walked on foot. When the last of the old generation began to fade, they left behind no monuments, only habits, lighting lamps early, checking the weather before deciding what to feel, saying grace even when there was nothing to eat. These small rituals were the architecture of survival. They required no witnesses, only continuity. A few younger folks tried to write down the old ways, but the elders only smiled. You can't trap wind on paper, they said, and they were right. The frontier had never been about ownership, it was about coexistence. To live here was to belong to something larger than yourself, something you couldn't name but could feel in your bones. As the century turned again, the town remained, smaller, quieter, but alive. Grass grew where rails had been, and wildflowers filled the space between gravestones. The river still moved, soft and constant, the last witness to everything. Visitors came sometimes, travelers looking for the real West. They found no gunfights, no gold, no heroes, only wind, silence, and a few stubborn souls who smiled kindly and said, "It's all still here, just slower." And it was true. The horizon was still wide, the stars still uncountable, the night still capable of swallowing every noise until only breathing remained. At dusk, when the last light touched the hills, the bell near the old schoolhouse sometimes rang. No one knew by whom. Its sound drifted through the valley, faint but steady, reminding the land and its people of an unbroken promise. It said, "We endured. We remembered why. We continued. We taught." And as darkness settled, the wind carried a single echo back from the river, gentle and infinite, "We are still here."